Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 9th Annual Conference of the UK Research Integrity Office. It's great to have so many people with us today, and I hope you enjoy the event. Today and tomorrow, our speakers will share their perspectives on the theme of good research practice, culture, environment, and sustainability, discussing lessons learned and how we can safeguard and enhance practices and systems, quality and ethical standards in research. I hope you enjoy our conference, and I look forward to hearing your own perspectives on these important issues, both in the discussion sessions of the talks today and also afterwards. Okay. Let's take a quick look at the schedule for day one of the conference. Then we'll do some housekeeping announcements, and then I'll hand you over to our chair to welcome you to the conference fully. Just so you know, we're using Zoom's webinar platform, and that means attendees have their microphones, their video, and their screen sharing functions muted. So you can see us, the speakers and the hosts, but we can't see or hear you. So sit back, put your feet up, grab yourself a tea or coffee, and get ready to enjoy the day. So we'll open with a welcome from Professor Sir Ian Boyd, Chair of UK RIO. We'll then hear a keynote address from Dr. Astrid Eichhorn on climate sustainability and the academic system. After questions and discussions with Astrid, we'll then have talks and discussions with 3 speakers exploring different aspects of research culture. We'll break for lunch from 1 to 2 p.m. The conference link will stay open, but there'll be nothing but holding slides, so you can have a break for an hour and then rejoin us at 2 p.m. for talks and discussions on systems and influences on research integrity and good research practice, beginning with a keynote address from Professor James Wilsden. After a panel discussion and a final presentation, we'll then close day 1 of the conference, and day 2 starts tomorrow at 10, as same time as today, with a keynote address from Sir Patrick Vallance, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. Now, to view tomorrow morning's sessions, use the same link that you used to access the conference today. And for those of you who are UK RIO subscriber representatives who are coming to the subscriber-only sessions on Thursday afternoon, those do use a different booking link. But the booking that you've just used to get into the conference now will work for you to access tomorrow morning sessions as well. A few housekeeping announcements before I hand you over to Ian to open the conference properly. So as I said, you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. You have your audio, video, and screen sharing functions muted. We welcome as many questions as possible. If you look at your Zoom toolbar, you'll see a Q&A button, and please use that to raise any questions to panelists and speakers. You can ask questions anonymously if you prefer. I should say that if you have questions or concerns about a particular research project, allegation of misconduct, publication, that sort of thing, please contact UK RIO via our website, ukrio.org, so we can give you the right level of support. We can't give you that level of support during in the Q&A stream of the conference, unfortunately. The conference is being recorded, and elements of this and copies of slides were made available on UK RIO's website at a later date and also on our YouTube channel. We don't have live captioning of the conference today, but we are looking to add that into the recordings. This isn't the only virtual event that UK RIO does. We have an ongoing webinar series that takes place every couple of months, with the next one coming will be announced very shortly. So please visit our website to learn more about our events program, but also other aspects of our work, our new 4-year strategy for the charity, which we just announced, and also if you have an interest in good research practice, in sustainability in the academic system, in improving and enhancing research culture and systems for research, we would like to hear from you. UK RIO is a charity. We have a fairly small staff base, and a lot of our considerable successes to date have been because of great liaisons and working relationships with volunteers. So if you're fired up about these issues of good research practice and research culture and systems for research, and think, what can I do about this stuff? Come to our website and there's information on how to volunteer with us. Finally, we're very happy for you to share on the conference on social media, and the hashtag for the conference is UK RIO 2022. Okay, I will now hand over to Professor Ian Boyd to welcome you to the conference on behalf of our charity.
Well, Luke, thank you, James, very much indeed. And thank you all for coming along. This for UK Rio is a great annual event. We've held a conference, I think, every year. I don't think COVID got in the way. Probably for about the last 10 to 12 years or so. This year is no exception, obviously, and we've got a very large number of people attending, which is absolutely wonderful, and it just shows the level of interest that there is in research integrity, rightly so. The theme of today's conference is, or the conference over the next 2 days actually, is good research practice, culture, environment, and sustainability. And the reason for focusing in on that is because of the great challenges that we're faced across society. So how can we maintain standards in research in these changing times? I was given some slides and I ought to share them. So let me get on and try and do that. And I've just forgotten to do that. So I apologize to all those who put the slides together. Here we go. So we've got the challenges that face us, and then how can we adopt new ways of working and reduce waste in research in particular, because research can be quite a wasteful activity. We use a lot of materials in research, and certainly in my own university, one of the biggest challenges we have is understanding how we can make the research process itself is sustainable, even if research practice is actually contributing to how we solve the problem of sustainability. And then what can the research community do to respond to the wider issues facing society? So there's some major challenges sitting in there. And these are big questions, and I look forward to hearing what all the speakers have to say about them over the next couple of days. And I'm also looking forward to hearing what you, the audience, have to say about them, because part of the answer is that we work collectively to achieve these good outcomes and good solutions. And UK Rio wants to play its part in that. And we think it's an increasingly important part. And as James has said, we've just published a 4-year strategy, which is trying to set out how we will build our part in that into the future. So what we want to do is achieve a great deal in the next few years. And that's building on UK Rio's considerable successes over the last few years, some of which I've also already mentioned with respect to the conference. And that 4-year strategy tries to achieve the charity's mission overall. And what we want to do is to make sure that the UK research community is applying the highest standards of integrity, quality, and efficacy across the board. We will, in due course, give more details of what that actually means in practice. So the strategy is a very broad document, setting a goal for the charity on the horizon. And what we want to do is make sure that that is backed up by an implementation plan in due course. And a part of that is that we want to make sure that all the collaborations that exist within this field work well, and we will play our part in that. And the other thing I would say is that we're trying to bring forward, or we have in the pipeline, an online training course which will be available to subscribers. So with that, I won't say anything more. I think it's time for us to get back to the business and get on with delivering the rest of the conference. And so I'll turn back to James to take us through the rest of the schedule. So thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to a wonderful day ahead of us. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to now introduce our first keynote speaker, who'll be talking about sustainability and the academic system. Dr. Astrid Eichhorn is Associate Professor at the University of Southern Denmark and a theoretical physicist whose research focuses on the fundamental building blocks of nature. She has a glittering academic career, has won awards for her research and teaching, and has been elected to the German Young Academy, der Young Academy, in 2018, and became quickly a member of the board of the Academy in 2020 and the Academy speaker in 2021. She also leads the working group on climate sustainability in the academic system at the European Federation of Academies, ALEA. And Astrid, myself, my colleagues and our audience are very much looking forward to hearing you today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, James, for the invitation. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. So let me start my screen share. Which I think everybody should be able to see now. So I'll be talking about climate sustainability in the academic system. And what I will have to say is to a large extent based on the work by the ALEA working group on the same topic. So ALEA is the European Federation of Academies, and the working group on climate sustainability in the academic system has very recently published its report that you can find online at this DOI, or if you just go to the ALEA webpage. Many things that I will say are taken directly from the report. So in my talk, I will have 4 key messages for you. The first one is that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. However, change is starting to happen and individual stakeholders are taking first steps towards climate sustainability. And beyond those first steps, there are actually many options of action that are available right now for all stakeholders to become more climate sustainable. And this transition, it's not necessarily just one that is filled with sort of problematic and negative challenges, but there are actually positive side effects and co-benefits in several of the actions for climate sustainability. And in the remainder of the talk, I will expand on these 4 key messages, and then I'm very much looking forward to discussing these points further with you. So the larger context of this talk is the climate crisis, where at 1.1 degrees of warming, I think the climate crisis is no longer an abstract threat, but for many of us, it's actually something that, for instance, through the increased frequency of extreme weather events, is actually something that is affecting many of us in our everyday lives. And in this broader context, academia is, of course, part of the solution through research, through education, and through evidence-based policy advice. However, there is a second aspect that has been much less in focus of the discussion, and that is that academia is also part of the problem through emissions from its own operations. And to make that point clearer, I would like to show some data and some examples. And in order to give us a framework in which to interpret that data, we will need some sort of guidelines or numbers in order to be able to interpret that data. And this framework comes from the 2022 IPCC report. So there you can find an estimate for a, quote, remaining, unquote, budget of greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit, to have a high chance of limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees. And that estimated budget is about 300 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And that number is a bit abstract. However, you can break it down to what it means per person per year until 2050, and then it's about 1 ton. Now, how should you think about that 1 ton? Is that sort of a very, very strict boundary? That's not the way to think about it. Rather, it gives you a rough guideline or a rough orientation. So if you have an action that leads to greenhouse gas emissions much above 1 ton per person per year, then that is something that is not very climate sustainable. And in contrast, if you have an action that leads to greenhouse gas emissions significantly below 1 ton per person per year, then that is something that is more climate sustainable. And so in that sense, we will now keep this 1 ton in mind as a sort of rough guideline when we look at some data from the academic system. Now, in the ALEA report, we have included all of those stakeholders that together make up the academic system and its framework conditions. And I will not be showing data on all of these. I would like to highlight 4 of the maybe most important stakeholders, namely universities, research institutes, funding organizations, and conference organizers. So let's get started right away with the universities. What you see here is a sample of 25 European universities. And you can see the greenhouse gas emissions per employee in tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And then you just see the number of universities that fall into each of these bins. Now, the first thing to note is that basically all of them are above this rough guideline of 1 ton per person per year. The second thing you probably see is that there is quite a spread in where these universities lie. Now, you might suspect that that has something to do with the profile of the university. So for instance, if a university is very international, then employees might use air travel a lot more. However, the key difference that makes this large spread is actually not the different profile, but the question of what is included in the climate reports. So those universities that are shown in lighter blue here, their climate reports typically only account for electricity and heating. So those include the so-called scope 1 and 2 emissions. But those are actually not all of the emissions that a university is producing. There are also the so-called scope 3 emissions. Those are indirect emissions. They come from, for instance, business travel. They come from building activities. They come from the supply chain, for instance, laboratory equipment or cafeteria food. And so these dark blue universities have more complete climate reports, and you see that they tend to cluster at this higher end of the axis here. And so probably these are giving us a more complete picture than those universities at the lower end in lighter blue, where the climate reports are incomplete. And so the conclusion to be drawn from here would be that we are currently quite significantly above this rough guideline of 1 ton per person per year. Now, let's move on to research institutes, where we can have a look very directly at greenhouse gas emissions that come directly from research activities. So what I'm showing here is an example from astronomy, and that is not in order to say that astronomy is a particularly climate harmful discipline. There are other disciplines which also lead to high greenhouse gas emissions. What is special about astronomy is that in astronomy, a lot of data is already available because a significant number of people have started to engage with the question of what is the climate impact of their research. So what this graph is showing you is the greenhouse gas emissions per year for a researcher in astronomy in Australia, about 42 tons, and then comparing to a research institute in Germany, about 18 tons. And both of these are clearly quite significantly above the 1 ton. Now you can see that a significant fraction of emissions is coming from flights in both cases, but also from electricity. And the interesting thing about that is that a majority of the emissions from electricity actually comes from scientific computing. So here we are looking at an example where a research activity is very directly causing greenhouse gas emissions. Now let's move on to funding organizations. Funding organizations do, of course, produce greenhouse gas emissions in their own operations. And that can also include the grant selection process. For instance, for the ERC, it has been estimated that because international panel members and international applicants are flown in, about 1 ton greenhouse gas emissions is emitted per interview that is being conducted. However, with funding organizations, we are also seeing a very significant data gap because, to the best of our knowledge, there isn't any funding organization that reports or even keeps track of the emissions from the funded research. And we've seen in the previous example with the research institutes that there can be research that causes a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is very likely a very significant data gap. Now, the final example is conference organizers. I think we're all aware of the fact that flying to an international conference causes greenhouse gas emissions. And this has been evaluated for a large number of international conferences across many different disciplines. And on average, there's 1 ton per participant of greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that is somewhat unevenly distributed. The fewer long-haul flights, of course, lead to more emissions than the many short-haul flights, but on average, it's about 1 ton. We all also know that the greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced significantly by going into a virtual format. They cannot be reduced to zero because running our laptops, connecting to a server and so on uses electricity that typically causes greenhouse gas emissions. Also, greenhouse gas emissions are caused in actually building the hardware that we're using. But nevertheless, there are estimates that the reduction compared to an in-person conference is anywhere between 94 to significantly above 99%, so a really high reduction. There may, however, also be a very good reason to hold a conference in an in-person format. And in that case, the choice of location matters a lot. So, for instance, having a conference where a majority of the participants comes from Europe, if you're holding that conference somewhere in North America, then that will lead to much higher greenhouse gas emissions than if you're optimizing the meeting location. So there are examples where optimizing the location leads to somewhere between 20 and 50% of savings. So to summarize what the key message of these examples was, it is that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. So then what does it actually take to reach climate sustainability? Climate sustainability is not something that is part of our culture in academia at the moment. And so a cultural change is required, which means it's a change in individual behaviors, but also a change in the framework conditions and in the norms and incentives. And the second key message of my talk is that there are currently individual stakeholders who are taking those first steps to make that cultural change. And I would just like to highlight 3 best practice examples. One is a change that is in some sense very simple to implement because it's a change that doesn't require a change in behavior. And so a top-down strategy, for instance, by university management can be successful. And that's installing green energy on campus, for instance, using all of those university roofs for solar cells. A second example is a more tricky one because it requires a behavioral change. And so a simple top-down strategy may fail. And that has to do with travel policy. And here I would like to highlight a best practice example from the ETH Zurich, where university management has decided that there should be a travel policy and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from air travel. But each department was then asked to come up with their own reduction goal and with their own strategy on how to achieve that. And so each department included their employees in actually coming up with a goal and with a strategy on how to get there. And this inclusive strategy of including all of the employees has led to a very high buy-in into the travel policy, at least according to surveys. And in the very first year after the policy came into effect, it has already led to a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from air travel. And the third current example is something where we have made experiences during the pandemic, and we are using them carrying forward to become more climate sustainable. And of course, the experience that I'm talking about is that we have learned that a lot of physical mobility can equally well be substituted by virtual mobility. It's actually not necessary to travel for each single committee meeting or PhD defense or seminar talk. Of course, there are a lot of cases where physical mobility and in-person meetings are still useful, but not all of what we have done in person before the pandemic actually needs to happen in person. Now, what happens beyond these first individual steps? So my third key message is that there are many options of action which are available right now for all of the stakeholders in the academic system to become more climate sustainable. And you can read up on them in the recommendation section of the ALEA report. And our goal in providing these recommendations was to not just formulate overarching principles and general guidelines, but to be very specific and to name a list of actionable steps that can be implemented directly. Now, when you go through these recommendations, which I hope many of you will do, you will find that many of those might seem somewhat obvious to you. And that is because in order to become more climate sustainable, the academic system doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of things that we already know how to do. The only thing that we need to do is actually do them. So what I will do now is I will highlight 3 recommendations that are valid for all stakeholders in the academic system, and then I'll move on to the individual stakeholders. So for all stakeholders, we are recommending a mix and match approach to meetings. So different meetings have different goals, and so therefore different formats, in person, hybrid, or online, might work differently depending on the purpose of your meeting. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. For instance, it's not a solution to simply say all meetings from now on, whatever the goal, have to be online. There can be very good reasons to hold, for instance, a conference as an in-person or in a hybrid format. So we are recommending that meeting organizers sit down and reflect on what is the best suited format and whether or not an in-person meeting can be substituted in one of the other formats. There will, of course, be a significant amount of meetings that will be held online or hybrid. And here an important recommendation is to improve our virtual communication. By that, I mean three things. First of all, we need further improvements in technology, both hardware as well as software. But most importantly, we also need to work on our communication, on our virtual communication skills. And by that, I don't just mean finding the unmute button on Zoom, but what I have in mind is that, of course, we communicate differently when we see each other as small Zoom rectangles where we can't see all of our body language. That is different from meeting somebody in person. And so we have to adapt our communication skills in order to make this virtual communication more successful. And we still have a long way to go and lots to learn. And the last thing about improving virtual communication is that often it doesn't work to just take an in-person format and translate that to an online format. For instance, if you just take a coffee break from an in-person conference and you just hold an online coffee break, that typically doesn't work as well. However, online, there are other things that can work. And so we need to experiment with those formats to find ways of organizing online meetings that make use of the new possibilities online and that work well. And the last recommendation for all stakeholders is to base your actions on a solid evidence base. If you don't have a solid evidence base, you might be putting a lot of effort into reducing a source of greenhouse gas emissions that is actually very small compared to some of the other sources. Having a solid evidence base is therefore important to formulate a good strategy that will lead to actual significant reductions. Publishing your evidence base is also important in order for you to be held accountable as to whether or not you're achieving those goals. However, it's absolutely critical to note that just publishing a climate report doesn't do anything to reduce your actual climate impact, so don't stop at publishing a climate report. So with that, I will now move on to recommendations for individual stakeholders. And here there's a longer list that you can find in our report. I will just highlight some of the examples, and I will actually not be going through the list of stakeholders here. Instead, what I will do is the following. I would like to ask everybody in the audience to put themselves in one of the boxes on my screen. So for instance, if you're leading a research group at a research institute, then look at the research institute box. If you're representing a funding organization, you can find yourself here. Or if you're involved in university management, then this up here is the appropriate box for you. And what I will do next is I will show some examples of recommendations, and I will stop speaking for 15 seconds to give everybody the chance to read what it says in their box. So here are the examples. I will now stop speaking for 15 seconds so that you can all read what is written in your respective boxes. All right, I hope you all had a chance to read the recommendations in your respective boxes. There is a longer list of recommendations for each stakeholders in our report. You might have noticed that there is a really important stakeholder that was missing here, and that's the individual academic. And this is because I would like to highlight an important recommendation here. The academic system is to a large degree self-determined. So there isn't so much outside influence in setting the framework conditions. In many of our roles as individual academics, we are actually part of shaping the framework conditions. For instance, when we're involved in university management or when we're leading a research group, or when we're part of a committee, or when we're acting as referees. And so for individual academics, a key recommendation is to consider all your opportunities for leverage. You might have the possibility to not just change your individual behavior, but to actually contribute to changes in the larger framework conditions of the academic system. Now, implementing those and other recommendations will lead to a transition towards a more climate sustainable academic system. And one of the worries that people often have is that this transition is one of negative challenges and that it will somehow impact the academic system negatively. And that is not necessarily the case, because there are also examples of actions which have co-benefits. And that's the fourth message, that this transition isn't necessarily something to be looked at in a negative way. There are positive side effects or co-benefits in several of the actions that you can take to become more climate sustainable. And I would like to highlight a few examples. One of the most important ones is that online or hybrid meetings are by now well documented to increase inclusivity. First of all, that's global inclusivity. So for instance, researchers from, in particular, the Global South, where travel budgets might be low or non-existent and visas difficult to obtain, they can very often not participate in in-person meetings, but can more easily participate in online or hybrid meetings. And that might in particular be true for early career researchers from the Global South. And similarly, online and hybrid meetings increase the inclusivity for researchers with care responsibilities or with personal reasons, for instance, health reasons against traveling. So that is a very important co-benefit of making meetings more climate sustainable. A second example is that cutting the climate costs can lead to economic costs, but there are also examples where it can cut economic costs. For instance, if you take actions that reduce your electricity consumption, like running lab freezers at a higher temperature, that is by now being done in many laboratories, that cuts electricity costs, which actually cuts the climate costs and the economic costs. The third example is that substituting physical with virtual mobility can actually mean time gains. If we don't have to travel for a full day to attend a 2-hour committee meeting, there is more time we have, for instance, for research. And lastly, if you travel, then switching the mode of transport can also mean a gain in working or in usable time. So this is just an example. This is a trip from Vienna to Frankfurt, comparing air travel by train. And of course, the flight is shorter in overall duration. However, a lot of the time is actually lost time, for instance, due to security checks and so on. So you actually lose less time by taking the train. More of the time is actually usable time. So these were just some examples of co-benefits, which means that this transition to a climate sustainable academia isn't necessarily just one that is challenging and problematic. It also has some positive perspectives beyond climate sustainability. And so with that, I'll come to my conclusion, which is just reiterating my 4 key messages, namely that the academic system is currently not climate sustainable. However, change is currently starting, and individual stakeholders are taking those important first steps towards climate sustainability. And beyond those first steps, there is lots that can be done, and there are many actions that are available right now for all stakeholders across the academic system to become more climate sustainable. And lastly, making those changes is something that isn't just a negative challenge, but that can bring with it positive side effects and co-benefits. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and I'll stop my screen share for that.
Astrid, thank you. That was fascinating. It's great to hear the insights that you and Alea have come up on this very challenging topic that I think sometimes can seem almost an insurmountable force, but it's great to learn from you that there are things that everybody at all levels in the academic system can use. And also hear you highlight the additional benefits. This isn't just about what's doing right for the climate and what's for the planet. There are benefits of inclusivity and connectivity. I mean, in the chat during your, in the opening part of this conference, I saw colleagues from India and Australia having a conversation. Now, in an in-person event hosted by a small UK charity, that would never have happened. And virtual means enable us at UK Rio to reach so many people compared to before. So there are benefits for organisations as well as individuals. It's fascinating. Thank you. We've had a lot of interesting questions, so I'll pick out a few from the chat. A question from Jane about waste in research. Is it possible to estimate how much greenhouse gas emissions we would save if we could reduce research waste? For example, research activities that are never published or not reproducible. Are you aware of any work on that?
I think that's a great question. I'm not aware of any work on that, but of course, this is one of the things where becoming more climate sustainable also ties in with other aspects of research integrity, reproducibility, as well as potentially open access, right? If you don't, for instance, publish your data, then other research groups have to reproduce the same thing. Whereas if you make your data openly available, then groups can collaborate, and the same thing doesn't have to be done over and over again. For instance, you don't have to run the same calculation on a big supercomputer several times. And so I'm not aware of any numbers. I'm not sure this has been estimated. I would assume it's very difficult to estimate. However, I think it's a great example where thinking of how we can save that type of waste ties in not just with climate sustainability, but also with these questions of research integrity, reproducibility, and open access.
Thank you. Jennifer asked the question about computing activities. Should the climate impacts of the academic system also include hosting, publishing, accessing of research outputs, or is it that this is already captured in some of the data categories that you mentioned? So publishers, library, data and institutional repositories, that sort of thing.
So that is, to the best of my knowledge, not typically included. Scientific computing has been estimated, but the question of how much, what is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that you actually need for data repositories and so on. I'm not sure whether this has been systematically taken into account in any discipline. I'm not aware of any work on that.
Fascinating. Perhaps there's some work for the publishers to do, looking at their impact on the system, and of course the repositories with the institutions. Thank you very much. Nicola said, thank you for a very interesting presentation, and noted that, as you said, it's difficult to replicate in an online format the ability to network with peers and with colleagues. So some aspects of in-person events are hard to duplicate. Do you feel that technology will improve sufficiently to enable this in the future?
So I would say there are already aspects of networking that to some extent are better. So my personal experience has been that after a lot of online conferences over the last 2 years, I've afterwards received emails by colleagues saying, could we actually just meet up for a quick Zoom chat and have a bit of a discussion? And those discussions are often more fruitful than the sort of rushed discussions that happen in a coffee break before one rushes back into the meeting room. So it is true that simply translating things like coffee breaks to an online format, that doesn't work as well. But there are other opportunities to build networks online, which I think is maybe just something we need to explore more or be more conscious of, or to some extent also change our culture and make it more normal to email our colleagues after a conference and say, can we please have a Zoom call to quickly discuss something? But I don't think that moving to an online format simply means that networking is more challenging. It's different.
Thank you. Richie asked, there's a culture of what we need to often refer to as presenteeism, and the fact that you feel that your colleagues and your senior and your bosses want to see you in person at things, which can and also want to see you in the office. So that can be do you feel that can be a challenge to people who want to take perhaps longer modes of travel to in-person events? They don't want to fly, they want to travel via land and sea, but that means they'll be absent from the office, from their desks and their labs for a greater period of time. Do you feel that can be a cultural challenge to try and shift?
Yeah, so that is definitely part of our culture that has to be addressed. at the level of individual behavior. I mean, just normalizing the fact that it might take longer to travel to a conference, but also clearly take that up with university management and explain why there is actually a usefulness to doing that. But I think during the pandemic, one of the things that we have learned is that also a significant fraction of work works equally well when it's conducted online. And I think many institutions are also transitioning into modes where work from home for a few days a week, for instance, is much more normal than it was before. So I think there is a change that is currently happening, and that will probably be ongoing.
Yes, I think we've been doing that at Eukarya for some time. I think it was fairly easy for us to make the shift because we're a small organisation. I know it's challenging for bigger organisations, but I think following the pandemic, where changes in working practices were imposed by necessity, institutions have had the opportunity to look at what working practices are worth retaining in the long term. We're getting some great questions in the Q&A. Also some suggestions, for example, people saying, could meetings take place during longer meetings on ships or on trains as part of conferences? So or should visits for conferences include longer stays to make the journey more worthwhile for broader collaboration? So it's great to see some ideas come up as well as questions. Kirsty asks, do you think it's likely that funding applications may ask for the emissions impact of a project proposal in the future? Do you think that funders might start taking this into account?
So I think there are a number of funding organizations that have started to think in this direction. And of course, then the key challenge becomes, how do you implement that without that becoming a big extra burden on the individual researcher? Because of course, for many of us, we don't necessarily have the expertise to really properly estimate what are the greenhouse gas emissions tied to our research. So the challenge here for funders becomes to provide good instruments to make those estimates efficient, to keep sort of the bureaucratic burden on the individual researcher low, and to also provide instruments that make those estimates comparable. If you just ask each individual researcher, please provide an estimate of the greenhouse gas emissions of your research, you will have wildly different numbers depending on what people have actually thought about including. So I think we will in the long run see research funders ask for climate impact estimates of projects. But the challenge here really is how to do that in such a way that it doesn't become a burden on researchers, but that instead it incentivizes researchers to think about ways, how can I do the same research with the same quality, but at a lower climate impact? So it's about setting the proper incentives, not about this becoming an additional burden on researchers. That I think is very crucial here.
Absolutely. I'm very glad to hear you say that. I think researchers and those staff who support researchers and are otherwise involved in research feel under a great deal of pressure because of the academic system already. And it's great to see this being presented as something which empowers and supports people rather than just adding additional pressure on top of them already. Amanda asks, she's a postgraduate student and wondered if you noticed in your slide that the student box was comparatively to others a smaller box, and wonders, is there more advice that you can give given that students will one day become academics themselves? So how can students become more involved so they can sort of, when they start their full academic careers, already be thinking along the lines that you are suggesting?
Yeah, so I think students are actually playing a really important role in the academic system, not just as future academics, but because they are really some of the louder voices in this discussion, and they are also in positions to help hold, for instance, university management accountable. For an employee at a university, it can be much more difficult to hold their management accountable and say, well, you're publishing this climate report, but are you actually reaching your goals? And students are in a much better position to do exactly that, to hold university management accountable, to ask for quicker change, to ask for things like, for instance, divestment from fossil fuels and so on. And so there are many examples across many universities where change of that form, for instance, divestment from fossil fuels, has actually happened because students have built up pressure and demanded that. So I would say this is really one of the most important roles that students have, is to pressure the rest of the academic system, and in particular also management levels, to make those changes that are necessary.
Thank you. That's really interesting. It's good to know that we can all play a part regardless of what stage we're at in our academic careers. Helen and Emily have both questions about offsetting of emissions. What are the views of Alea on carbon offsetting as part of the institution? Is it considered helpful or potentially bad practice to offset?
That is a very tricky question. I would say it has a lot to do with how you offset. I think it should be clear that offsetting should just be the last resort in a strategy where you actually reduce emissions. And then as a last resort, if you have emissions that you really cannot reduce, then you think about potential ways of offsetting. There are some examples of universities that, for instance, offset travel emissions in such a way that the cost of that goes into a university-wide pool, where the university then, for instance, buys equipment for virtual meetings from those offset costs. So those could potentially be better ways of offsetting than some others that exist. But of course, the challenge with offsetting is that it can create the psychological effect of saying, well, I've offset, so I don't actually need to think about reducing my climate impact in the first place. And therefore, offsetting should really be sort of the last resort. And if it's done, then think about meaningful ways of offsetting.
Thank you very much. Mandy asks, do you have any data gathered during the Alea work on the climate cost of disposable items used in research? We had a presentation at last year's annual conference, and Martin from the LEAF initiative, he talked a lot about how even in small amounts, disposable items, their environmental impact can become quite large quite quickly. She was wondering if you'd looked into this.
Yeah, so indeed, in laboratories, the use of plastic instead of glass is one of those topics that can have significant climate costs. I don't have any numbers off the top of my head, but a number of initiatives across various countries have looked at that and have also provided recommendations on how to reduce that. And the LEAF initiative, of course, is one of those examples where you can find a whole list of actions on how to cut down on those emission sources. More broadly speaking, it's true that at universities, actually, the supply chain seems to be really a very, very big factor in greenhouse gas emissions. And that, of course, includes supplies of laboratory equipment. It is also something that very, very few universities are currently including in their climate reports. So in a lot of cases, I think it's still a blind spot how much the supply chain is actually contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular also the supply chain that provides laboratory equipment, including disposable items such as single-use plastics.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Monica asks, you're being asked a lot of requests for data on particular aspects of waste and the climate damage in aspects of the research system. Monica asks, and it's a very good question, is there any data about the use of paper? Institutions seem to be moving more towards e-books and electronic access to journals. During COVID, many universities moved towards electronic theses submissions and away from the traditional paper copies. Now, that can seem to be greener, less physical items, less paper, less trees being cut down to make paper. But obviously there's the electronic, the impact of all the electronic devices and everything else. So is there any data on whether moving from printed to electronic materials is helpful? And is there anything else that can be done in this area?
So I'm not aware of data that makes this explicit comparison. I'm aware of data where, for instance, universities have calculated the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that is tied to their paper consumption. And that is a very, very negligible fraction compared to the other sources of emissions. A similar statement can be made if you look at greening conferences. Then, for instance, one of the things you could think about would be to not print your program. And again, that is an incredibly negligible fraction, so the really, really tiny fraction compared to just having a few less participants fly in. So I would say overall, this is one of the actions that is much more symbolic than actually impactful. And this is where it's very useful to actually have an evidence base, to just be aware of the fact that this is a change that doesn't make a big difference. That doesn't necessarily mean that at some point you shouldn't be thinking about that. But it's not something that will make a big difference. And indeed, I'm not aware whether anybody has compared to the increased or potentially increased greenhouse gas emissions if you just need more electronic devices because you no longer have a paper library.
Yes, no, that's a very good point also about, it may seem, oh, it's obvious we'll just stop printing our conference programs, but of course neglecting the fact that you're still having many people come through non-sustainable means to a conference in person. Interesting point from Gavin in the chat about sort of the cultural and equity and equality aspects of this, noting that at most institutions, the high profile academics will probably be the last people to lose their international travel costs, and it could be that those who are more junior will be under the most pressure to cut down their international travel and possibly lose out, or compared to their senior colleagues, at least bear the brunt of most changes. So this will need to be enacted with equality and inclusion very strongly in mind, and also with different countries, as Gavin noted in the chat, taking different approaches to this. Again, there could be people in certain institutions finding it easier to access international conferences in person, say, than others, and again, that could lead to inadvertent discrimination. Do you find that there's a push to make people attend in-person events still, or are people more open these days about the benefits of online and hybrid events? I should say, in the UK mainstream media at the moment, there are a lot of loud voices. They appear to be a minority, but a loud minority, saying, well, we should get everybody back to their offices as we did before the pandemic, where in reality most organisations and their staff do seem to be embracing flexible working much more readily.
I would say currently it's a mix that is happening, which is probably very characteristic of when a certain cultural change is happening, that there will be loud voices on both sides. So within my research field, for instance, I'm seeing both a strong push to go back to in-person conferences, but also people who are now consciously stepping away from in-person conferences and organizing online events. And let me just comment also on the previous point, because I think that's a very important one, the question of who gets to travel and how does this impact early career researchers, because there are data from a number of institutions that indeed show that if you look at career stages, then travel is very unequally distributed. And it, interestingly, in those studies that have looked at this question, it doesn't correlate with research impact. So for instance, if you try to measure that by something like an age index, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the amount of travel and those indices. However, there is a correlation with salary, and indeed the more senior, higher salaried employees tend to fly significantly more. And of course, for early career researchers, it can be much more important to travel to build their networks. So indeed, keeping that in mind and asking the question, if somebody travels from a research group, who should that person actually be? I think that's a very important conversation to have.
Absolutely, a bit of more equity and participation in those kinds of things would be important. We've had some interesting notes in the chat about this. Richie notes that for international students, sort of cultural exchange is often considered an important part of their studies, and also that the kudos of going to visiting academic institutions in another country, especially when institutions have, say, overseas campuses, for example, visiting the main campus is seen very important. You know, how do we make sure that people don't lose out on such cultural exchanges, but they're also done more efficiently? And Emily notes that, you know, if students are unable or unwilling to fly to go on field trips, for example, they could lose out in comparison with their peers. So that the kind of inculcation of early career researchers and students perhaps needs to change somewhat and change across the board. Pardon me. Astrid, that was a fascinating session. Thank you so much. We'll make sure we circulate the slides. I know the one that has the boxes where everyone can see where they fit in, and the fact there is something that we can all do at all levels of the system is, I think, it was very practically useful, but also very kind of positive and empowering message to send about this very big, very significant challenge, not just for the research community, but for every country and the entire human population. So thank you so much for coming along today. Thank you also for everyone who placed their questions. We haven't been able to answer them all, I'm afraid, because of time issues, but we'll look at how we can follow those up at a later date. So Astrid, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy listening into the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James.
Okay. We'll now move on to our next speaker in our research culture strand. Dr. Sam Oakley from the University of Glasgow will be talking to us about how to inculcate and support a healthy research culture through the means of training and supervision. Sam has been a member of Research and Innovation Services at Glasgow, and her role is focused on ensuring researchers have the appropriate training, resources and support to develop their own research capacity, so empowering them to do the best research they can. And this can include a variety of means through training and support and various programs at Glasgow, which there's an awful lot of work on research culture, as previous attendees of our previous events will know. Also a bit biased here, it's great to see another archaeologist on the program. So Sam, welcome aboard. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, James. Right, I'll just share my screen. I should say that I have the dreaded internet is unstable message appearing occasionally, so I'm hoping that this will be all right. So can you see my slides, James?
That's come through just fine.
Fabulous. And I'm going to stop my video just to make sure that I'm not using up unnecessary bandwidth there. So I'll turn it back on at the end. Thank you. Right. So thank you very much indeed for giving me this platform today. It feels such an honor. I want to use my time to speak really about how we create a culture to support research integrity with a real focus on the role of the doctoral supervisor. So they work within a research culture that helps or hinders them. They also create that culture for others. And I think probably some of what I say will be relevant to the wider concept of supervision of early career researchers, perhaps by PIs, but I will be speaking specifically about postgraduate researchers, or PGRs as I'll call them. So as James said, I'm based in research and development. I work at the intersection of promoting and supporting research integrity. And also I am involved sort of to the side with our research misconduct process. So I'm kind of bringing you today what I observe and learn from that.
That wasn't a good start, but it got worse.
Sorry, James, I don't know if you can, I can hear somebody else talking if they can mute.
It seemed to go offline. I had to restart.
I'm just going to carry on. So today, what I'm going to be drawing from primarily is the reflections of our researchers. So I'm really it's really fortunate. Our research integrity training is online, it's purely online, and it's reflective. So we get a set of short responses from every researcher who does that. So as well as reading and responding to those, what I can do also is synthesize and study those reflections to help us build our support and our understanding of what researchers need to improve research integrity actually on the ground in a very practical sense. And for today, I look back specifically at what people have said about supervision. So that's really where I'm coming from. And I'm really sort of foregrounding care for supervisors. I think that's really, I mean, not saying we shouldn't care about the PGRs, but today I'm foregrounding the supervisors. And I think it's very clear to me how much supervisors worry about the expectations upon them, generally, but also specifically about research integrity. And I think this has been made worse by the pandemic, certainly. We tend to regard supervisors as role models. I sort of observe this, it seems to spread through policy and literature on research integrity. I find that quite simplistic. I find it quite a risky view. I don't think we can just label them that and then walk away. So my question for today is, how do we support doctoral supervisors to promote, teach, and embody research integrity. So that we, I think it's primarily institutions, but it's also sort of perhaps relevant more widely to the whole ecosystem of research. And of course, I'm going to state the obvious. I don't need to tell you, supervisors is a huge, diverse crowd of extremely clever people. So of course, you've got those subject differences. And I think it's really worth reiterating, the language and the content of research integrity can really alienate people if it fails to fit their discipline. I found in my training, you just have to keep stepping further and further back and being really careful about the vocabulary to keep it broad enough and to make sure that that discourse works for everybody. And I think we all benefit from that. I don't think that's a problem. I think it's really good to make some people aware that some researchers are aiming for subjectivity. We're not all trying to be objective. We have real, specialist corners like creative practice. Pure mathematicians have their own wonderful view on all of this. So everybody brings their own perspective, and I think it's all the better for that. But also that diversity. Are the supervisors, some of them are more experienced than others. Some of them are more engaged than others. Some of them are more biddable than others. And also, I think really important to note, not all of them will have had a good experience themselves. So we had a recent workshop. We asked the room and we said, was your supervisor a role model for research integrity? And only really half of them said yes. And some of them had some real, bad experiences. So supervisors are certainly not all learning from good examples that they might have had. So what unites them as a crowd? So apart from the job and the structure that an organization puts around that role, I think my observations as a trainer would be that what unites them is a shared experience of a culture of overwork, pressure, a sense that the system is working against them, not for them, particularly for this particular task of promoting and supporting research integrity. This comes loud and clear from the responses to the training. You don't need me to tell you this. We've had that wonderful report from Wellcome on research culture. And they flagged it, right there. And they said, while there were some examples of poor behavior by principal investigators and other supervisors, these were in the minority. Most respondents saw their supervisor as decent and trying their best, but constrained by a system that rewarded outputs and money over individuals. So I want to acknowledge this, and I want to register this as an absolutely a major issue. But I'm not going to focus on systemic issues for the rest of this talk, really. I'm going to focus on what we can do at a more institutional, practical level. So my main question about how we support supervisors, I want to expand it into 3 further questions, and then I'll talk about each of these in turn. So first of all, do we recognize the complexity of the supervisor's role for research integrity? To what extent can training help? And to what extent can improving research culture help? So we're thinking about the complexity of the role that they have. I think until we really understand all the nuances of this, we're not going to do our job supporting them with research integrity. And I think, there is a recognition that the current model that we have has issues. So again, this is from the UKRI Research Integrity Landscape Study, which says that a common model assumes that supervisors will instruct their researchers in research integrity. In many cases, however, supervisors are not trained themselves and may not feel recognized for providing this instruction. So I'd like to point out as well that even that simple statement, supervisors will instruct their researchers in research integrity, I mean, it gives me pause. What does that actually mean? Now, I know I've seen already, I know my colleague Emily Woolen from Edinburgh is on the call, and I'm possibly Catherine Winchester from the Beatsons here too. They will recognize this. We had a go at mind mapping what we thought research integrity training should include. And I know you can't read that. And that's because it was such a giant mind map that it's not even possible to put it on the screen. So the point I'm making really is that research integrity is a vast, sprawling poorly defined curriculum, if you like. So even expecting one supervisor or even a group of them to encompass all of this is a huge ask. And also, it implies really what we're asking or trusting them to do is to pick and choose which bits of that giant map they might want to speak about. So I think, that's not helpful. So if I think about the role of the supervisor, I kind of, based on what I've seen and observed, this is how I would interpret perhaps how they see themselves in a way. Yes, they do have a role as a guardian for research integrity, that idea of somebody who is staying vigilant, who is spotting issues, who's giving guidance to correct the PGRs. Now, I think we very clearly do not make them officially responsible if a PGR has a misconduct issue. But certainly in other parts of the world, this does happen. At an extreme, they might get sacked. And supervisors may well come from cultures that have a different attitude to their responsibility or, to the formal responsibility. But I think even here, if your student does get into a misconduct incident, which is rare, but it does happen, the supervisor will be involved. Questions will be asked. Why wasn't something spotted? What guidance did your student get? What training did they complete their training? All these kind of questions will come up. And you can factor into that situation tension about perhaps tension within supervisory teams or power imbalances or other vulnerabilities. And you can see how incredibly stressful that can be for supervisors. And I think anyone who has experienced that becomes a real advocate for being much more proactive about preventing issues occurring and, and what they do in their own supervisory practice to sort of cover their backs. I also think at an extreme, some supervisors can become victims of unreasonable PGR expectations or misconceptions. I think authorship disputes often wander into this territory, and that can be very, very difficult to untangle. And this often, this obviously relates to how the supervisor has set expectations, kept them flexible in changing circumstances, and perhaps is able to have difficult conversations or not. I did notice that when Sweden set up their new National Misconduct Agency, which I think quite quickly got swamped, many cases referred to the agency, they said, were the result of personal disputes, particularly between PhD students and their supervisors. So, there is a lot of, that can be quite a confused space, I think. And of course, we do have, at the other extreme, some supervisors may be to blame, the villains. Not many, but, there are bad authorship decisions, unrealistic expectations, sacrificing quality for speed or quantity. And again, that Wellcome Research Culture Report said that 1 in 5 junior researchers and students have felt pressured by their supervisor to produce a particular result. So that does exist. And then, of course, the role model, the mentor, the teacher, doing it all right, showing how it should be done, the Jedi Master training their young Padawans. That's the sort of the model that I think perhaps we tend to sort of associate with most readily. But this is what I'm sort of feel quite strongly. This is what we should do. We should support supervisors explicitly with the risks and challenges of research integrity, as well as placing our high expectations on them. So obviously policy has a role here. And I think how we frame that, how we frame their work at an institutional level is really important. So at the University of Glasgow, we have the PGR Code of Practice, and I think that does an amazing job. You might have something similar of separating out really clearly whose responsibility different aspects are. And it's very clear that the PGR themselves is responsible for their own research integrity. We also have a code of good practice in research, and that makes clear that the supervisors and the PIs, their role is to create that environment, to create a research environment of mutual cooperation, we call it. What I'm not so sure is whether the policies make it clear where the boundaries of the supervisor role are. And we've got amazing support in place at Glasgow. I think we're lucky, it's well resourced. We've got research integrity champions and advisors, a fabulous data management team, wellbeing support for PGRs, graduate schools. But what's not, I don't know if every supervisor is fully aware of how much they can draw upon other people or how much they feel able to sort of push a problem to someone else. I'm not sure we clearly define that. I don't know. I'm not sure. I worry about that. And I also think, of course, the processes that we put around supervisors, do they help or hinder them? And particularly occasional processes. I'm not sure how well aware they are of things like the misconduct process, and that can feel quite daunting if you suddenly find yourself in it. So my point here is generally, I think if we want to engage supervisors deeper in promoting and supporting research integrity and that positive culture, the support for supervisors needs to be, perhaps more focused and a bit more engaged. And obviously one way to do this is potentially through training. So the question there, to what extent can training provide the answer? I think, obviously I'm a trainer, so I'm a little bit biased. I think it's part of the answer, but, it really has to be good training. It has to be training with a very clear sense of its role in a bigger picture and what it's going to achieve. And I think, I do think training needs somebody to care for it. I'm really lucky, Glasgow put the resource into creating my post. It's not all I do, but it's a big part of it. So, I'm there, I respond to the training to everybody who completes it. And, I'm listening and learning from it and improving it. But it does need to be integrated, I think, into the organisation, people, systems. So what I thought I would do is just quickly tell you where we are at the moment. And I still think of this as a work in progress, really. So this is kind of how we knit together research integrity training with supervision. So our PGRs, they all have to do research integrity training. They do it in their first year. And we're very clear now, this is really labelled introductory. It's a foundation. We make that very clear to them. We're not saying you do one bit of training and you're done. This is meant to be a start. What we try to do is to give them the big picture, the sort of things that get covered, a simplified version of the things that get covered under research integrity. And what we want really is to activate them. So we want them to start thinking, what applies to me? What's most relevant to me in this? What do I need to talk to my supervisor about? So we're really priming them to go forward and have more conversations. So obviously, if we're doing that, we need to make sure that supervisors are ready for those conversations. So we do have, a program of staff integrity training. Within that, there's a really short module that's specifically on supervision. So the training has a big sort of general part to it, and then you can pick 3 things out of a selection that interest you to look at in more depth. And one of those is supervision. I've noticed that module is particularly popular, and it does seem to me that people are doing it not just who are supervisors, but who aspire to be supervisors as well. So what we do in that is we're telling them what we're telling their PGRs. I think that's really important, that supervisors know what the PGRs are being told. And we make it very explicit what the supervisors need to follow up on. And within that, we also suggest to them some ways they can promote research integrity, and also we advise on evidencing that support. So what I think we're trying to do really is activate both sides to get some activity going in this research integrity space. So what we say to them about what they need to follow up on is we sort of say to them, your PGR has had a general introduction. We need you, the supervisor, to give them more subject-specific advice. So I think that's really important. What does good research look like in whatever area you're working? What are the questionable research practices for your subject area that your PGR needs to guard against? Now, they know those because that's in our training. One of the earlier questions that they reflect on is what is the questionable research practices for your subject. So they do already have an idea in their heads about that. We also ask them to follow up on the local research culture. How can your PGR contribute and succeed in that environment? And also, really important, how do you show care and respect for everybody in that environment? And I think it's that equality, diversity, inclusion angle that's so important. So we're putting really well-being really at the forefront of when we're talking about research integrity. And I know we've got Rachel's talk later on. It's really good to see that that's being brought into this space so clearly. I do have a checklist for supervisors. I'm not a big fan of checklists. And obviously, it's not meant to be a tick box, but I think they do appreciate having a set of prompts for planning discussions. And of course, you've got that excellent UK Rio checklist for researchers that can be used in this space as well. So that's telling them what they need to follow up on with their PGRs. We also suggest positive actions to support research integrity. So this is the list that we put up, and this isn't an order. This is just a suggestion of things that you might like to do. So things like having supportive, really important, occasional spot checks of whatever raw data or material the PGR is working with, just checking that they're producing it correctly, that whatever they're doing to it, they're doing it correctly, that everyone's understood the training and that it's all being done correctly. So just very occasionally having those spot checks. And I should say that the welcome report that did highlight, that research culture report highlighted that a quarter of junior researchers and students found that their supervisors didn't regularly review their work. So I think that, that is a valid point to make. Might be obvious, but there's no harm in restating it. Point 2 as well, just ensure that you have expressed the standards and expectations that you have around the quality of the work and make sure those are understood. Number 3, minimize stress. Just 2 words, but it's really important to make that connection between research integrity and the stress that people get under and then therefore make mistakes or fail to ask questions when they need to. Ensure training is completed and demonstrate that positive approach to compliance. So those are just suggestions. And we say to our supervisors, what would that look like in practice for you? So that's kind of positive actions that they can take or think about taking. We also talk to them about, their own peace of mind. So if you think back to the idea of they might become, a victim, they might become involved in a misconduct case. If they want peace of mind about that, I think most of these points are good practice anyway, but just ensure you keep a record of discussions if you have them, as well as you having closed discussions in, supervision meetings. If you can have those conversations in wider groups or disciplinary discussions around things like expectations and standards, that's great too. And also, making sure you track that really explicit support for training and required governance activities. And again, we ask our supervisors, what support do you need with that? There's lots of people that can help. And I think, like I say, a lot of this is just good supervision practice anyway, but we're really signposting strongly support and really just restating that all of this activity, it supports research integrity. So I have noticed this section of our training, and I think it's taken me longer to tell you about it than it would have done for you to actually do it because it's not very long. It gets a lot of appreciation. People like it. I think it's imposing order on this sort of big expectation. New supervisors say it's really useful for them to structure their activities. More experienced supervisors say it's a sort of reaffirm that they're doing the right thing. And they, sometimes people say, oh, I could do a bit better on that one aspect. So it's kind of just helping them reflect on their practice. And also really big relief from supervisors that we acknowledge well-being as an issue within this. So we do only require research integrity and supervisor training once every 4 to 5 years. So I think, That's a long time. I think if you think about the things we're talking about here today, sustainability, we've got Sam coming up talking about reproducibility and open practice. I think, even 4 years ago, would we have really emphasized those in supervisor practice? I'm not sure. Keeping supervisors up to date is really important. But above all, I'd say, I think all the work that we put into training is not going to pay back if we don't have that local support within the individual departments and teams. So really, this links directly to culture. And this is the last part of what I'm going to talk about today. You don't need me to tell you about this again. Glasgow's done a lot of work on research culture. I think there was a talk on it last year. We're not alone in this now. There's a huge investment, isn't there, going into research culture, particularly I think Research England's made lots of money available for it. I've seen a lot of research culture posts being advertised. I think, it's big right now. This is how we've defined it at Glasgow. Colleagues are recognised and valued for their varied contributions to research. We support each other to succeed. We are supported to produce work that meets the highest standards of academic rigour. So obviously, it's really helpful to have this very high level, strong institutional signal that this is what matters. And this certainly, it shaped how I developed our research integrity training. But of course, culture happens at different levels. And really that microculture around the supervisor and their students is critical. The supervisor can't control that wider environment, but they can also make or break the experience for their PGRs. And unfortunately, some do prevent the bigger good intentions from reaching the students. And sometimes this will be completely unintentional. I think that most institutions, I'm sure, have plenty of people on the ground, roles and experts to support supervisors, which really, that is the culture, part of the research culture, the supervisors experience. So, as I said, at Glasgow, we've got the really strong graduate schools, research data team, integrity champions and advisors, the central integrity team. We've got the backs of the supervisors. There's always that challenge of comms. I think institutional communications is always difficult. And I often find that awareness of these sort of, support teams isn't as good as it could be, particularly our integrity champions and advisors. I mean, they're there to provide safe and supportive conversations. But if people aren't aware of that, that's a real missed opportunity. We've also developed a new supervisor community of practice. This has just started this year. So really moving away from the model of mandatory training to a much better, wider peer support for supervisors. And generally across the board, there's much more mentoring activity happening at Glasgow, I think, and that's fabulous. Always that worry that the people who engage are the ones who are already engaged, and it's how do you reach the ones that aren't engaged? That's always the challenge there. So there's lots of resource going into culture, and it's also making sure that policy and communications fit that aspiration. But for me, I think, the number one issue in terms of culture and supporting research integrity really is workload and time. And I think this is where it's faltering most badly. This is, again, another quote from the Wellcome report. They were speaking about how metrics and key performance indicators, KPIs, are often prioritized, and little emphasis would be given to activities such as training or supervision for which there are insufficient structures in place to measure performance. It's always that thing of we measure the things perhaps that are easiest to measure. And obviously one of those is counting students who complete, how many doctoral students complete, but that tells us nothing about the experiences of anyone involved and the human cost, either on the PGR, the supervisor, or, or the wider culture. But how do we give people time? This is so difficult, but everything that people get excited about in terms of supporting research integrity, things like supportive peer review networks for research in progress, or, having time departmental meetings to discuss some of the questionable practices. There's so many good intentions. I think that people get inspired by ideas in the training, activities they could do. But these often, if these don't then happen, is that the fault of the training, or is it the culture, or is it just this workload model? Time and time again, it's emphasized as critical for research integrity and good supervision. So obviously I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's really important to say this, that, more time would help everyone do this stuff better. The only thing I am going to say on a practical level, and this is a really tiny, small scale solution, I think perhaps there could be more discipline specific activity on integrity topics, because this is things like conferences and networks, they happen anyway. And I think some of the questionable practices, people are quite excited about continuing those discussions. And perhaps one way to carve out a little space could be to integrate that more into these existing activities. And I think some disciplines are doing a fabulous job on this, psychology being a key example. So that's just like a tiny suggestion, not detracting from that major problem. So I'm going to finish now with 2 wish lists. So what I think, this is my entirely subjective opinion on this, what I think we need for this to work, if we want to really get supervisors working well for us in championing research integrity, I think we need to give them a manageable, sustainable role. I think that role needs to be part of an institutional and wider research integrity ecosystem, which has good support, good policies, and an interesting and integrated training program and timely targeted communications. It can be really easy to forget to communicate to our supervisors and remind them of all the stuff that's there to support them with this. And I haven't talked about this really at all today, but capturing that PGR voice and feeding that back into this process is also really important. And I do run the PGR sessions, so I can do that to some extent, but I think more work in that space would be really useful. And finally, I'm going to contradict everything that I've been saying about we shouldn't regard supervisors as role models. And I'm going to tell you what I think they can role model. So this is what I think they could role model and should role model. I think we need to see them showing that constant quest for quality. So interrogating their own current practice to try and find improvements. And I definitely include greater openness in that. I think that's really important. We want to see them embracing open research and all that that can bring. I think we want to see them showing how to have a really positive debate. If they can show humility and an open mind, that's creating that space where everyone feels comfortable to perhaps question themselves or what they've done, talk about mistakes, really important. I think if supervisors can show their PGRs, perhaps make this explicit, I'm sure they're doing this already, but how they're managing to even partly resist that pull to publish faster at the expense of quality and work harder at the expense of their own well-being. I'm not saying we expect supervisors to fully do that, but even small steps that they're making, that's really useful to share. And finally, I think that always actively promoting kindness, everything that the supervisors can do to create that supportive and inclusive culture is really, really essential for quality research. And I think, obviously there is a challenge in that. And I think managing PGR well-being is very difficult. But, there's never been more written about this. And there's so much good work going on at the moment. The Supervising PhDs blog, the Hidden Curriculum blog, I can share these links with you. There's certainly so much research out there to support them with this. So I think engaging with that is like so important. If they can carve out even just 5 minutes a week to read an article, that would be a really good start. So that is all I'm going to say on the subject. I've really just been making the case that a bit more thought into how we support supervisors can really pay back big time in terms of support institutionally for research integrity and for research culture. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much indeed for listening. You've got my Twitter handle if you want to take it. And now I believe I'm supposed to have questions with James now, so I shall stop my screen share.
Yes, that's right. We've had lots of questions come through and lots of interesting discussion in the chat as well. So thank you very much. We've had so many questions. I don't think we'll get through everyone, but Sam's thankfully made her Twitter available, and I'm sure we'll find other ways to follow up with her afterwards. Okay,
please pick the easy ones, James.
Easy ones. Okay. Right. Okay. Richie asks, how much do you feel that training can only be effective where the culture is one that openly recognizes how much kind of game theory there is in current models of publication, grants, income, reward, and recognition in academia? Do you feel training has to be realistic about the reality of the so-called publish or perish system?
Yes, definitely. And I think certainly, like say, I'm sure many institutions will have signed up, for example, to DORA and be championing responsible metrics on one level. But my goodness, the challenge of getting that, for example, to percolate down to, departmental level, I think that's really, really difficult. And obviously, even, our departments, they're working within their global research culture. So you have to strike a realistic note. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that in training. And what interests me is that gulf between you've got the aspirational policy and the reality. So I think, certainly what I try and do, is really just push the things that can help on the ground. So for example, remind people we've got responsible metrics and remind them why. Also things like using the credit roles in the credit taxonomy for authorship. Just there are good things out there that you can push. And I think just helping people move forward, but being realistic, absolutely, that the bigger system is often still a very big challenge.
Thank you. Amelia asks, do you have any thoughts on the most effective form of communications to researchers? Is it videos? Is it newsletters? Is it presentations? If so, is it virtual? Is there one very good way, or is it, or lots of different ways, the best ways to adopt?
Yeah, I think there's no easy way. We all want an easy way. There is no easy way. I think all we try and do really is try everything. I think definitely, don't waste their time. So you really honing your message is so important. And like, for example, in the training, it takes so long to whittle it down to be short. That's where the work goes in. And I think same with communications, have really targeted messages. I mean, we've started a blog, which we use to support our sessions. And I could share a link to that. We run sessions, but I think trying to get in at departmental level and getting, local advocates who will champion what you're trying to say as well, that's incredibly helpful. Trying to get into those departmental away days can be useful. And then, yes, occasionally sending out, central comms. If you can, it's not often, at Glasgow at the moment, I'm sure this is not atypical. It's not actually easy to contact all the supervisors in one go. Even that is a challenge. So I think you just have to try all the different options that you have, but always hone that message.
Thank you. So a very multifaceted approach. Gaynor asks, when you ask students if their supervisors were good role models for research integrity, had you defined what research integrity was so the students were giving an informed answer?
Sorry, I think that's a misunderstanding. I asked a room of supervisors if their supervisors were role models of research integrity. No, I hadn't, because actually I think part of that conversation was, what does that mean? What does that actually mean in practice? It's actually very hard to explain. For the students, for the PGRs, we do lay out in their training course what we're sort of talking about for research integrity. And it's slightly simplified, but it does give them a sense of the spread of the topic without overwhelming them. And again, that's not easy, as you probably know, James, from your work.
Absolutely. Jane asks, are you aware of any data or ongoing studies about whether training programs like this can be demonstrated to improve research quality after they've been implemented at their institutions? So in terms of the impact of your own work or in training in general?
No. I can't imagine how you would show that, because I think the variables Like if you're looking at the end output of quality research, what would that mean? Would it mean you have fewer misconduct cases? But as it is, most institutions have very few of those anyway. I don't think that would measure it. What would it mean? I can't imagine how I would ever show that level. I could indeed do a program of work to evaluate my training, perhaps through assessing what people think of it and what they say they're going to do from it. I might even come back and ask them a year later to say, did you do those things that you were inspired to do? But as I said, I don't know, because if they've never, if they haven't, was it because they didn't have time? That's not my training's fault. I mean, I just find that such a difficult concept. I absolutely take the point that I'm not presenting to you graphs of this many people like my training and this many people. I do get a huge amount of sort of qualitative feedback. So that's what I'm basing this on. But I really would love to hear if people have got ideas for doing that, because I find that a real challenge. I mean, obviously we evaluate it, but if I tell you that 80% liked it, what does that mean? It doesn't mean they're going to
absolutely
better research.
It's fantastic. I would recommend you have a look in the chat afterwards, because there's some fantastic stuff in there. Okay, a couple of broader questions. Are your research integrity materials open access, RCM? I think, does that mean, are your training materials something that people can view online if they want to have a look at them?
They're not at the moment. I would really love to make them open access. I think obviously they're very much full of Glasgow specifics.
Sure.
So it wouldn't be anything that somebody could just take and use off the shelf. As I think that's definitely something I'm working towards, particularly with the supervision module, which is really very short. I was hoping to make that available. But as you know, making things open takes time, and it's just having that space to do that. But I would love to do that. Yes, absolutely. But I think, thinking about whether you've got the resource to support the training, that's the real challenge as well. I know for other places I've worked at, that's not always easy.
Thank you. Now, I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions. You've generated an awful lot of comments and discussion, Sam, and if you have time, I'd say have a look at the chat stream, because lots of interesting and thought-provoking comments and suggestions and ideas there, which you may find of interest. Thank you so much for your talk today. It was fascinating, and I know at UK Real will definitely, we talk to you quite a lot, and we'll definitely want to be talking to you more about this topic. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
We will now move on to our second Sam of the programme. This is Dr. Sam Westwood, who is a cognitive neuroscientist based at the University of Westminster, and as a keen advocate of open science, he set up the Riant Science Club at King's College London, an early career seminar series. It's kind of peer-led, providing training in best research practice that is now supported by the UK Reproducibility Network, and has been recently awarded an award by the Society for Improving Psychological Science. And Sam has also been shortlisted for the Dorothy Bishop ECR Prize for his work in promoting open science. I've heard Sam speak before. I've spoken at the Rights Club events. I know I have a lot of interesting things to share with us today. Sam, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Right, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully this will work okay. Let's see. Okay, so I'm assuming that is full screen. So I'm presenting.
Full screen.
Okay, brilliant. That's all good then. Great. Okay, so yes, thank you so much for the invite, especially to and well done all the organisers. It's a fabulous, great sort of set of speakers, and I feel a little bit bad because I've sort of cut short a really great talk, I fear, of Sam Oakley, some of which I will sort of go over as well. So it'd be a nice opportunity to sort of touch on areas that need more oxygen, I think. So I'm going to sort of talk to you for the next 20-25 minutes about how we can sort of lower barriers of entry into open science and how to incentivize it, and sort of hopefully move away from just talking about this stuff and actually putting it into action. So I'll just jump straight in. So as we know, there are lots of misplaced or perverse incentives, if you like, in academic research culture. And these are, broadly speaking, sort of an overemphasis on novelty and innovation. We have the publish or perish culture and this sort of relentless focus on the individual, the heroic individual. And these can undermine lots of things where our research is concerned, and also the research culture too. So efforts to confirm and verify previous findings are often shelved to prioritize novelty and innovation. Quality is shelved to prioritize quantity of scholarly outputs. And of course, by prioritizing the individual, we can thwart attempts to collaborate and be collegial and be part of a wider scientific community. And as touched on by Sam in her talk just now, these incentives don't come from anywhere. They are built on a confluence of factors, vicious cycle, building blocks, call it what you will. And these meld together in different ways and cause all sorts of pressures on researchers. But broadly speaking, the kind of take-home message is that we've sort of created this sort of job evaluation criteria and sort of performance metrics that prioritize publication and grant funding track records, which has meant that researchers increasingly are moving away from getting grants to do research to actually doing research to get grants, to bump up their grant capture figures. There's a focus on H indexes and sort of rather than what you publish, but where you publish, and also prioritizing novelty and innovation in the peer review process. And really, really important is the workload. So many of the sort of innovations that, whether it's research integrity offices are trying to implement through training or whether community-led initiatives, many researchers disregard them as just one more thing to do. And so they are much more willing to hold on to their long-held routines because it works for them, or they just want a peaceful life. So because of this, no wonder we're in a replication crisis. Perhaps quite a shrill term to use, but I think we can safely say with not too much exaggeration that we're in some sort of turmoil now with how we can reproduce the results that are being published and whether we can even replicate studies. And given that replication is a cornerstone of good science, I think we should be concerned. So most of the conversation and the noise that's been generated has been focused in social sciences, psychology, but more worryingly, for the snobs in the audience, even the more harder, more important sciences, if you like, to make a value judgment. And I think we can make a value judgment because on the right here, we can see a replication attempt to look at cancer biology, which is incredibly important, of course. And what they found is that when they tried to replicate the results from previous findings, there was a 46% success rate. So 1 in 2 effects that were tried to be replicated were successful, which is, I mean, how did we get to this in the first place? But those are the attempts that were carried out. This group of researchers wanted to actually attempt to replicate results from 193 experiments, but they could only replicate 50 experiments. So forget whether they conducted a replication and what did they find. They couldn't even get to the front door and attempt a replication because the quality of the reporting, the available information was just substandard. So I don't know how we got here, but the incentives and the perverse incentives give an indication of why we are here. But not only is sort of the research integrity or the quality of our practices an issue, the culture is an issue. And no wonder we're seeing this sort of brain drain. Now, we've always seen there's a lot of shift and flexibility in where PhD students, postdocs, lecturers land. They may not stay in academia, they may leave. But it's very different when you see senior lecturers right and up to full professors leave. And I've seen over the past 2 years now, this becoming quite an unusual phenomenon. And this has been picked up by Marcus Manafo in a recent piece, but also in a commentary piece in Nature as well, that people are leaving academia in a non-random way. And Sam already mentioned this, but the Wellcome Trust survey sort of shows you why. You know, there is a pressure to craft a certain narrative from the results through harassing the results until your findings present a particular result. There's issues with bullying and harassment. There's issues with performance metrics. And when you ask people, you know, why do you stay in academia despite these downsides, you often find it's, you know, because of mortgage payments, because they're concerned about whether they'll get another job. So academia has this sort of captive audience, but this situation is just simply not sustainable. Many of the innovations in research, programming, being familiar with coding, being familiar with transparency, participatory research, all of these innovations that have been strung along in the open science movement are really attractive in UX research, in data science, in industry generally. So if you have this academic culture that is hostile to good quality research and is not conducive to a nice place to be, then why bother going in academia? So at the minute, I'm seeing sort of academia as a sort of stepping stone to get the skills to go into industry, but it won't be long before people say, well, why bother? Just get work on the job, just go straight into industry. So we have a real, I think, a brain drain crisis on our hands as well. So what do we do? Well, we know what we need to do. We need to realign best practices with what we reward and recognize, and we need to lower barriers of entry into these good best practices. And I use best practice and open research practices interchangeably. Now, the good news is that the slow creaking wheels are beginning to grind into action. We've seen quite significant successes in DORA, Plan S, and the top guidelines, all of which are sort of encouraging researchers, publishers to sort of reward and recognize open research practices. But as Sam Oakley has said, and as we all know, it's one thing to sign up to these things, it's very different to implement them. And we've already seen with the recent debacle with ResearchFish and UKRI and the contrast between their public persona and what they say behind the scenes, but I won't go into that anymore. And then you consider groundswell, the sort of bottom-up initiatives that are coming to meet the top-down ones. So the sort of community-led, consensus-based practical guidelines and resources and journal clubs, most notably reproducibility. But these sort of indirectly touch on a group of people that I think are the squeeze middle, the ones that are, you know, maybe they want to do open research, but they, you know, they just don't know how, or they have all of these competing other interests that just mean that they just can't do it. And it's kind of basically what Sam Oakley said in her previous talk, but it's more focused on people within the supervisory world, and those are senior lecturers. In my view, you're not going to get wider adoption, which remains elusive at the moment, wider adoption of open research and best practice if you don't get more senior academics on board. These people, they review papers, they review grant bids, they can inform academic policies, they are members of scholarly societies, and they're important decision makers. And these include senior lecturers right on up to full professors. And I feel as though these are kind of being missed. They're only indirectly being touched on. And I think so I wondered, you know, in my advocacy work that I've been doing for the past 3 years now and speaking with lots of people, so I have like anecdotal discussions with people, but also the evidence is bearing this out now and it's kind of, I feel almost validated in what Sam Oakley said as well, which is sort of certain themes come up. You know, senior academics are hesitant to try and advocate for open research practice because it can be seen as punching down or ladder pulling. You know, they got to where they are by, you know, adhering to standards that are below, I guess, what we are trying to aspire to today. So it's seen as like you're almost pulling the rungs from underneath junior academics and getting them to do even more hard and more laborious research. They also, you know, don't want to be unpopular in their department, in their university, and they don't want to give more workload to an already prohibitive workload of researchers as well, because there's just a simple lack of time. And people have long-held research routines that they just don't want to budge from. And so you have this awkward situation where you have people who want to help, but they just don't know how. And they're also given loads of overwhelming information. The conference today is packed with constant information. How do you navigate that? How do you know what will work for you and how? So as James mentioned, I started the Riot Science Club, which has been really successful. It's been franchised in several universities across the UK and increasingly in Europe now. We've got about 5,000 nearly followers on Twitter. It's been really, really great. And we run sort of training sessions every week. And members of the team sort of got to think, is like, how can we deal with this situation where we're potentially missing out on this sort of senior academics? How can we ease them into open science and sort of improve research integrity in a way that's easy? And, we were thinking, things came like the moral case for why we should make research better is kind of easy and winnable, right? You're not going to get people say, no, we should keep research integrity as it is. I mean, you might do, but in my experience, these are a cringing minority. But really, there's loads of barriers in the way of people doing it, as I've mentioned in my throat clearing of this talk. And one of them is what is in it for me? If I'm going to do this stuff, what are the gains? So that was a common theme that we came across. And we also, because of workload, because of time, that you need to have some sort of guide or something that is very short, sharp, sweet, and to the point, that can signpost other information, and it's just really digestible. So we got our minds together, and we were inspired by this sort of 5 selfish reasons to work reproducibly. And we thought that this was particularly a good, compelling argument for why you should to conduct good research practices. So we published this recently, which was a 3-step guide into how senior academics can support and practice reproducible and open, transparent research. And basically the 3 steps is change how you hire, change how you assign credit to scholarly outputs, and change how we fund and publish. And we tried to aim for the most easiest things that you can do to make slight changes that would have a big sort of impact on research integrity and culture. So change how you hire. So the great thing about open research practices is that they confer so many competitive advantages, not only in terms of the job market, but also competing with other academics in your field. I mean, talk about impact. Open access can, on average, accrue greater citations. So can if you preprint your work. Registered reports mean that you can pre-register your stuff based on merit and get a guaranteed publication regardless of the results. So you don't need to worry about trying to craft this beautiful, simple narrative that's hard-hitting and will get you published. And so, you want to do this stuff, but, training in this stuff takes time. Things come up, you can't do it. So we thought, well, why not import this talent, import all of these skills by just changing hiring and promotion criteria so senior academics can have a really good research team that can do this stuff. Unfortunately, evaluation criteria, the boilerplate job specification is, what's your teaching, what's your publication track record, what's your funding, and oftentimes you miss all of the other research skills that can yield all of these great competitive advantages. And as I say, there's massive overlap in open research practices. Now, you're fortunate enough, senior academics are, that there's loads of guidance now of how you can sort of change your assessment criteria. But again, this falls in the trap of being overwhelming and mishy-mashy. So a very simple one, which was based on a bunch of academics who kind of had this consensus idea, which is basically just change your person specification criteria and include, whether in the desirable criteria or essential criteria, open research skills. So, have you got a track record of open data? Have you done pre-registration, peer review, data? Have you shared data, materials? And make sure that this is obviously publicly available and clear so you can attract that talent, but also show that your institution is in support of these sort of practices as well. And of course, this will be a dialogue with members in your department and team and so on to ensure that you don't unnecessarily disadvantage individuals or whole research areas as well. So, you know, an ECR would probably not be expected to get many open access publications, but they might be expected to, you know, have done sharing data code and stuff like this and preprints. And to give examples of how you can do this, Felix Schombrot and colleagues are collaborating with us in putting together sort of a collation of examples of other job specification criteria that have been used in different universities. So I realize I'm just checking the time, so I think I'm okay. I might eat into my question time, but the rest is quite simple and digestible. So that is a way to sort of accrue all of this, this ticks the self-interest box, right? Hire people that are practicing this stuff that will confer an advantage. Then it's credit and allocating credit. So Sam Oakley already mentioned this, and I'm sure people are aware of contributorship and so on. But again, in the paper, we make a good argument, in my view, that, you know, from an ECR's perspective, discussions about authorship are a particularly toxic and problematic discussion to have, but also they can thwart publications. So from a senior academic's perspective, sorting out this authorship issue is a really important point. So from a self-interested view and also from a research integrity view, authorship is a really important thing to get right. And it's something that was brought up in the Wellcome Trust survey as well. You know, authorship disputes can delay submissions, they can even lead to retractions, and they can have a deleterious effect on people's mental well-being as well. So that said, one of the reasons why, I mean, there's lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons why there's issues around authorship is because there's a lack of a sort of consensus-based and comprehensive standard. And there's the Vancouver guidelines, but these don't really deal with contentious issues like first and last authorship and corresponding authorship, large collaborations where it's difficult to dissect who did what and to what degree. And of course, it ignores contributions outside of writing. So, input from a statistician who might not help with the actual writing. Now, Liz Allen, who spearheaded the credit taxonomy, gave a great talk about this for the Riots Club. But basically, a credit taxonomy is one thing that you can use to incorporate into your normal practices where authorship is concerned, or you can make a full shift towards contributorship. And credit now is adopted by leading publishers, and with good reason. You know, it's a consensus-based classification system with 14 distinct contributor roles. So for those who don't know, it has contributor roles from basically the beginning of a research project to the final scholarly output. And it gives you nice definitions of each component of that kind of research life cycle. And basically you just slot names of your research team against each of the roles that they actually contributed to. And you can do this anytime in the project. You can do it during the write-up. You can do it part of a contract leaving, and that safeguards senior academics who are, left with the paper that they have to write because their junior academic has left, and also the junior academic can safeguard that this paper will not be given to somebody else once they have left. But also from a senior academic's perspective, it's really good for them to do it as soon as possible in the whole timeline of a research project. By doing it first, they can manage expectations, they can delegate jobs, and they can also motivate people, because people would be motivated to get as many, initials of their name against the different contributor roles as possible. So it could even motivate them to work harder, and of course, senior academics to be more efficient. You can tweak the credit taxonomy, just to say this as well. So it's not just cataloguing things, you can change the definitions, but you have to keep the contributor roles, and you can change the degree of contributorship to lead, equal, or support. And there's lots of advantages to this, as I've already mentioned. So it deals with authorship disputes. It's a good framework to help ECRs navigate those hard conversations. But it also, by signaling to others that you care about making sure that each individual contribution has been properly, transparently catalogued, you signal to potential collaborators that you are collegial, you are collaborative, you are a nice person to work with as well. And given that we are moving towards collaboration, over just staying within your lab. I think that's a really good thing. Okay, so that's touched on hiring and promotion, credit taxonomy, so dealing with importing talent and also making sure that you are improving the culture around credit and also making your research more efficient. Just to finish on changing how you publish and fund. So we know now there's lots of policies and changes in funding and publication journals in their policies and valuing open research practices. So we decided to deal with a key issue, which is most of this information is sort of siloed. So we, my colleagues, Alex and Laurie, for the paper, they did this sort of data scraping where they look for co-occurring words of open research, open science, and funding opportunities. And we created a compiled list of different funding opportunities, from where to go to get open access funding from, to where to go to get, much larger pots of money to do kind of funding to research projects. So like 100K from the Einstein Foundation to do reproducible research. And that was an effort to sort of signpost this stuff that senior academics could either use to find out where they should seek funding to do kind of open research, but also to pass it on to their junior academics to encourage them to seek out funding opportunities. But of course, the other issue is that there's such overwhelming information about what funding policies are regards open research practices, but also publishers' policies as well. So we created a table that puts together different websites that actually compile all of this information in one place. So that was there just to allow senior academics to just try and find very quickly, okay, where do I need to look for to see what this funder's policy is for, open data? I want to make a grant application to them. What are their policies? And to get a nice overview as well. And also to hold journals' feet to the fire if you feel as though you've been dealt a shorthand or unfairly treated by particular journals, and you can use, say, the top guidelines or Sherpa Juliet or Romeo to sort of give you more clout. But what I want to sort of quickly finish on is one area which I think can make a huge difference to advocating and implementing open research practices. Very easy, can be done tomorrow, is pre-printing. Now, pre-printing is far more common now, but still people that have a hesitancy. So I'm going to try and make a polemic about why you should pre-print and why there's fewer reasons not to. So I've already mentioned that pre-printing can increase your, well, before I do that, for those who don't know, so a pre-print is basically the article that you would submit to for peer review, okay? But in addition to submitting it to peer review, you upload it to a preprint server and you get a timestamp to that preprint, and it can be made freely and publicly available. Now, by doing this, you can make your article open and publicly open within 24 to 48 hours. And so this means that you can increase the readership and the citation impact because it's been in the public more. By the time it comes to publication, you can increase the feedback because the community now can give their feedback. It's also recognized in REF and increasingly on job evaluation criteria. So Wellcome recognizes preprints as a legitimate scholarly output. Now, there are myths and reasons to be hesitant about preprints. So, could they hinder your chances of getting published? Very few journals now actually don't like preprints, but it's always good to check out those that do and those that don't. And Sherpa Romeo is a really great resource to try and find what the policies are by journals, but by no means is it a prevention to getting published. The scooping issue is a big concern for research, but it is a bit of a myth. So if anything, preprints can prevent being scooped because it's time-stamped with a DOI. So you can say, okay, well, you've plagiarized my work and I've got a timestamp to prove that your work came after mine. So there's all sorts of issues. And increasingly now editors are telling me that in really hyper-competitive fields where they get quite similar submissions to a given journal, they can use preprints to establish precedent, and that obviously ticks the novelty and innovation thing, and also helps with the navigating really competitive submissions. So just to finalize and leave time enough for questions. So what I've said to you, it's not a magic formula. There is no magic formula. There's no one size fits all. It's not all or nothing. But really what we try to achieve with our preprint, with our publication, I should say, is, trying to deal with what are easily implementable actions that senior academics could take that would accrue a big change within their research team, within their department, and maybe even across the community if enough people were to take it up. I think there's a lot of discussion about quite structural changes and quite top-down things, but thanks to institutional inertia and just general exhaustion from academics, really, those are quite challenging to implement. So hopefully you can see that these are, easy things to do that I think most academics can just quickly do and just keep pushing the wheels of change forward. I will quickly say that, and just a quick plug, that we are holding a teaching and mentoring conference on the 29th of June. All the details are there. Please check it out. But it's basically going to be a really nice half-day conference where we talk about how to encourage open research through changing teaching and mentoring students. Okay, so that's enough for me. I think I've got 10 minutes for questions, hopefully, and I'm not horribly misjudged the time. So I'm going to stop sharing and then can see you all.
We're absolutely fine with the time.
Okay.
So yes, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. Lots of interesting comments in the chat and stuff coming through the Q&A. Okay, so a few things. Right, okay. And non-attendee says, a lot of these practices require academics to know a lot, open specific app to do credit, know where to find open science funding. Is this really helping make things easier for academics in terms of workload, or is it adding to that workload?
I think so. I wouldn't say so. I'm very much somebody that goes off what academics have told me and what they have found easy to implement. So these are not like theoretically this should help. So I find that particularly with credit, well, let's take preprints, for example. I had a particularly resistant supervisor, didn't like preprints, but then as soon as they realized that they were going to get scooped because I presented something at a conference and they needed to have a timestamp document to show that we were the first, to do this kind of work. Yeah. They were 100%, that's a great idea, Sam. Same thing with when they reviewed grant funding panels, they increasingly saw the applications on the CVs that there were lots of preprints listed there. In terms of the credit, again, I find that the authorship disputes can really have a significant deleterious effect on the cohesion of a team and the delay of a submission. So even though there's an initial learning curve, which I don't think is a massive learning curve, there's Tenzing, which I list on my slides, which is a really easy thing. Oh, one thing I should say about Tenzing is that it's basically a Google sheet that allows you to put in all of the credit stuff, really easy, 5-minute job, easy peasy. You can, because it's a Google sheet, you can send it out to the other authors and they can do all the admin for you, put it all in. And not only does it create a table with all of the credit listed or the authors next to all the credit roles, it also creates the cover sheet for you as well. So you don't need to do all of the superscript 1s, 2s, and 3s and all the affiliations and the title and everything. It does it for you. So these are, by design, being created to minimize the admin load. And so I do think that initially it might mean, yes, there is one thing to do, but the gains and the effort required to do it is, I view, quite minimal for at least one of the steps, if not all of them. Sorry, that was quite long-winded.
No, absolutely fine. More in-depth answers, the better. Okay, a couple of more questions about preprints. Richie asks, is the risk with preprints that non-peer-reviewed data analysis could save things? that don't have proper foundations. So an exciting story can kind of get away before being stopped or retracted. And Ian asks, in general terms, do you think preprints can compromise on research quality?
I mean, peer review hasn't done well, has it? And impact factors haven't done well either. I mean, there's this graph that shows that retractions are correlated positively with impact factor. I mean, for me, I just would like academics to read their papers and to critique them. So they're going to do peer review anyway. I mean, I'm not an academic that would just say, well, this has been peer reviewed and therefore I trust it. And I think most academics do the peer review of their own, really. For me personally, I think preprints add value in that they disseminate the information quickly, and I think they actually do perform a key role in the quality control. If you see the preprints that have circulated during the pandemic, yes, there was an issue with how the results were communicated, but that was an issue with the press releases and how the media picked up on it. But generally, there was a huge kickback from academics. And I think academics should have greater faith in community-based post-publication review, which I think was far more effective. And there's also an issue with peer review, which is, we've all seen it done where people bring their own biases and own issues to the peer review process. I know academics that have rejected a paper because they have a similar paper on it. They have their own vested interest to see. So I do think they are a net boon rather than an issue.
Brilliant, thank you. A question about ethics issues for preprint. How do you find in practice things like ethics approval, consent for publication of patient images, that sort of thing, work on the preprint model?
I think that's a separate issue. I think that's more of, data sharing and data archiving rather than, I mean, you're going to disseminate that information. As I say, like your preprint is usually the equivalent, is the same thing that you submit to a journal. So whatever issues that there are with sharing data would apply to your peer review publication as they would to the preprint.
Yeah.
So I think it's a separate thing. I mean, what I can say is that with the ethics point is that it's much easier to do it up front at the beginning and sort it out at the beginning of the ethics process than to retrospectively sort it out. So, if you want to publish responses from participants, make sure that is sorted out before you even apply for ethics.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, a few more questions. Someone asked about, you mentioned the brain drain in academia earlier on in your presentation, and someone said, is that really a problem in that a large majority of PhDs tend to leave the profession?
That's what I mean, is that, as Marcus said, PhDs, postdocs, lecturers, they tend to leave. There's an issue with a pyramid scheme in academia, right? That there are only so many places to fill. What is odd and what is unusual is that full professors are leaving, readers are leaving. That is unusual. People have committed their lives to doing it and increasingly report being disillusioned. So that is a concern. So I don't think it is something that is just the general way of things. I think things are changing.
So if the senior people who, it could be argued, I suspect not by senior people, have it a bit more comfortable than other people in the research system. And we should be worried about that, but also the implications it has for people in more precarious career structures. Thank you. I do think what's really interesting about this stuff is the fact it addresses, through open research, we also address broader issues within the research system, like a lot of problems with authorship. It tends to be discussed late in the research project. Mm-hmm. So at best, you have people who formed their own quite understandable individual perspectives on how authorship of a paper should look like. And at best, you have 5, 10, 15, 20, 40 different perspectives you suddenly have to resolve in a short space of time. And of course, authorship disputes, if there's an authorship dispute, a journal will say, we're not going to publish this until you sort it out. So there's an impact on dissemination of data, whereas these practices encourage people to think about and anticipate issues earlier on. I think that's a very good focus to have, and helps inculcate kind of a bit more self-reflective research practice, which has lots of benefits in other ways. Thank you. Okay, Malika asked, there have been surveys at the University of Oxford about preprints with some concerns that they could be misleading due to lack of peer review, which you kind of touched on before, that this could lead to an extreme growth of publication numbers, and also there's that race to publish first, which could potentially impact on the quality of the research available. Did you have any thoughts on those kind of points?
Yeah, I do have misgivings that they're echoed by Malika, and hello, Malika. So basically, I mean, I could even add to that and say that people might use proxy indicators of the quality of the preprint. So, you know, the academics, whether they're leading experts, or they might use the university from which they come from. And there is a mass proliferation of papers, but for typically, I generally think that, on balance, it will just encourage people to be more critical in their peer review. And I think because it is publicly available, people will have greater opportunity to criticize and to have a wider critical discussion of a given paper without the prestigious journal or the prestige of it being peer reviewed labeled on top of it. I mean, there's been studies where they compared preprints against publications, and what they find is that typically the difference is very slight, and it's usually in how clearly they are written.
Yeah.
So in terms of the quality and everything, the data as yet hasn't really borne out. I mean, this was pre-COVID, so I can't really speak of what it's like after, but I do think that it's more the response, the critical response, that needs to be addressed, rather than, you know, just the dissemination of papers, in my view.
Thank you. One final question. I mean,
okay, I'll be brief.
Your focus, quite understandably, is on open science, but there's greater drives towards openness in research across all academic disciplines. How, from your perspective, how applicable are lots of the stuff that you've been talking about dealing with to the non-STEM disciplines? Is it mainly a case of there are kind of themes that other disciplines can pick up on, or in your experience working with researchers from other disciplinary groups, can sort of practices that, for example, you've been talking about be easily picked up by someone, say, in the humanities or the creative arts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and keep it brief. So personally, when I was at King's, I went to loads of different interdepartmental meetings, and I was embarrassed. I came with this ECR with very lofty images. So this paper, I keep calling it a preprint. This paper I wrote was born out of like years of just trying to narrow down what is a universal guide for people. So I do believe that we would land blows in lots of different disciplines, because these are all systemic issues. So I do think that they are broadly applicable. To what degree they are applicable and to how they could get things moving is very discipline specific. I mean, physicists were doing the stuff that psychologists are doing in the 1950s, what psychologists are doing today. But, it could be at least the issues around authorship and how you do that is definitely a sector-wide issue, for sure.
Very much so.
So yeah, hopefully that was 1 minute over.
Absolutely fine, and very helpful answers and a very interesting discussion. And again, as with all other speakers, lots of interesting comments in the Q&A in the chat. So Sam, thank you very much for
thank you
with us today. And we'll put a booking link to the Wrights Club event in the chat, because having attended Wrights Club events, they're definitely worth going to, regardless of your discipline and regardless of your place in the academic system. There's lots of interesting stuff discussed at them. Sam, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We'll now move to our last speaker from the morning sessions, Dr. Rachel Cowan from the University of Manchester. Rachel, thank you for joining us. Rachel has over 25 years experience as a cancer researcher, organisational developer and a qualities champion in higher education. She's led a variety of institutional strategic developments to support academic excellence and improve equality, diversity and inclusion within research. And Rachel, we're very glad to have you here today to talk about this very important issue for the research community and indeed for society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, and thanks to UKRIO for the opportunity to speak. I'll just share my slides. I just have a thumbs up or a yes, that's fine. Can you see?
That's up at full screen, thank you.
Brilliant, great. So I am Rachel Cowan, as James said, and my preferred pronouns are she and her. And I'm going to be talking about and using Manchester University as a case study of how we're embedding equality, diversity and inclusion in research practice and culture. But before I launch into the initiatives and some good practice sharing, I really want to just emphasize the case for equality, diversity and inclusion in research, because I think one of our biggest challenges within research and innovation and within the higher education sector is really prioritizing equality, diversity and inclusion. We see it as an add-on, something that will be sorted out by the EDI teams within our organizations, and we don't take individual responsibility for this work and really approach research through the lens of equality, diversity and inclusion. So there are three real drivers to really prioritise equality, diversity and inclusion. Obviously in the UK, we have the Equality Act 2010. There's legal obligation for us to ensure that we anticipate and prevent any discrimination against anyone from protected groups. As a large organisation with more than 250 employees, the University of Manchester has a public sector equality duty, and we must report our gender pay gap. So, you know, there's obviously that legal requirement. There is obviously a moral case. It's the right thing to do. As an institution, Manchester also has one of its primary three goals, alongside research, teaching, and learning, we have social responsibility. And so, you know, it really is part of the what it should be to be a student or staff member at Manchester. It should be the right thing to do and fits with our social responsibility ambition. But on a pragmatic level, it's also business critical. So we want to be an institution that attracts diverse global talent and can nurture and support that talent. And we know from a large research evidence base across all sectors that diversity of thinking, perspective, background really drives creativity and innovation. And if we don't prioritise equality, diversity and inclusion in research, we really will limit the questions that we look for solutions to and the ideas that can be brought forward. And we won't be benefiting everyone across the whole population in an equitable way. So what we've done, and as I say, I'll be using Manchester's data, which is published as part of our Equality Information Report, which we publish annually. I'll be using it as a case study example, but we are by no means an outlier, and we are very much classic of the picture that I will paint will be classic for research intensive universities across the UK. So the first place we're really focusing our attention on is looking at who is within the researcher workforce at the University of Manchester and how diverse are we, and who is able to progress their careers and is celebrated and rewarded within our current culture. So here you will see a graph of our classic leaky pipeline. It's mirrored, as I say, in the wider sector. I've presented some data for HE across the UK, as well as data in the purple there and on the graph for the University of Manchester. So we have, through our student admissions and real widening participation and access to higher education, in terms of gender parity, we've really made significant progress. So you can see that we have gender parity in our student profile at undergraduate level and at postgraduate level. In fact, women are in the minority within the postgraduate community at Manchester. But when we then look at further along in the academy pipeline, what we see is at the early career researcher stage, the lecturer stage, we maintain that parity. But at the higher levels of senior lecturer, reader and professor, we start to see a lack of diversity with respect to gender coming through and significant underrepresentation. This is despite having Athena Swan, the Gender Equality Charter within the UK, and for many colleagues, committed colleagues trying to drive gender equality within the sector. You know, we have been a signatory on Athena Swan since 2008, and we only had 12% of our professoriate who were women at that time. actually through Athena Swan initiatives, that has now risen to 28%, the latest data for 2021. So we are making progress, but it's slow, and that's with respect to gender. When we look at wider protected characteristics, we have robust data for race and disability. For beyond those 3 protected characteristics, our data is poor, and that's an area where we need to improve across the sector. But when we look at Black, Asian and minority ethnic profile at student and staff level, again, we see a leaky pipeline. At the undergraduate level, 32% of our students are from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background, really showing the international composition of our students. When we then look at the postgraduate level on our taught master's level programs, this drops to 26.3%. And then when we get to postgraduate research level, it's down to 15.1%. And then when we look at the staff profile with respect to race, we see this significant loss of ethnic diversity at the early career level compared to our undergraduate profile. And this continues to drop, such that at the professor level, only 11.3% of our professors are from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. If we then disaggregate this and we look not just at that BAME classification, which is blunt and we're moving away from, and we were, for example, to look at Black professors, we have only 6% of our professoriate who are Black. And if we look intersectionally at women and ethnic identity, we only have 1 Black woman professor at Manchester, and that's Professor Dawn Edge, who I share my academic lead for EDI role with. And that's something that really needs to change. And as I say, we are not alone. This is a sector-wide issue. We've only really just started to collect robust data in terms of disability, but again, we are seeing roughly around 11% of our students and staff with a declared disability. But as we move through the academy to more senior level, we see this drop down to 2.7% at the professorial level. So we really do have this loss of diversity in terms of our academic career pipeline. And this is just showing some data from Advanced HE looking sector-wide. And here you can see the image shows starkly, we have 14,000 white male professors in the UK. And as I said, we only have 35 Black women professors in the UK. So what's happening is it's resulting in both gender and ethnicity and disability pay gaps within our institutions. And we are committed to really closing these gaps by really supporting people from with protected characteristics to move up through the academic career path. And also to look at who are influencing and key decision makers within our organisation, and looking at our senior leadership team to make sure that we have full representation that reflects our community at that earliest career stage. So what I hope I've shown is we've made real progress with respect to gender, but now actually we really need to focus our attentions intersectionally and particularly at ethnicity. So it's not just about the workforce, though. We also have been looking at our data and qualitative information around the experiences of our researchers at the University of Manchester, as have many of our colleagues across the wider sector. So we have been looking right throughout the research life cycle, as I say, at who's celebrated and rewarded, but actually who are we engaging to shape and hone and identify key questions that we should be asking and answering through our research, looking at who's being funded and leading as principal investigator and on grants, and also how we are openly sharing and disseminating our research in an inclusive way. So I just want to now share some of the initiatives that we've been driving forward to really embed EDI, both in workforce and practice and culture. And as I say, we're not alone in this. And, there really is a call to arms, if you like, across the sector. And, multiple documents from Wellcome, UKRI, from the government, really saying we must look at the systemic issues that exist within the research and innovation space, identify barriers and dismantle any inequalities that limit ambitions, inclusion and participation for the benefit of UK research and innovation. So we've looked long and hard more generally beyond the pipeline data, and we see bias and disadvantage in our recruitment and promotion process, particularly for ethnic minority researchers. 5 years ago, we saw the same for women, but we've really closed that gap and addressed those inequalities in terms of recruitment and promotion. We also see grant disparities. So we see success rates that are significantly lower for ethnic minorities and for women who are applying for and receiving lower grant funding than men. Through our qualitative surveys, we both of university staff generally, but then also a specific research culture survey that we ran just before the pandemic in 2020, we see cultural issues and perceptions of reward and recognition. So women research staff perceiving lower levels of recognition for their work. And we have a strong dignity at work policy and zero tolerance of discrimination, bullying and harassment. But through our qualitative work, we know that women, ethnic minorities and disabled staff are significantly more likely to report that they've experienced discrimination, bullying and harassment. So we're committed and working hard to address all of these things and to really level the playing field, because we fully recognise that there's within the HE sector and within our organisation, there's a myth of meritocracy, but that privilege, bias and disadvantage plays out. So we have a programme of work to promote inclusive recruitment. We have obviously the essential training around inclusive recruitment, equality, diversity and avoiding unconscious bias. We have increasing use of unconscious bias observers and a commitment to diverse and balanced recruitment panels. We also are working and actively using positive action. So where we have historical underrepresentation and our data shows 3 years of underrepresentation, we have used ring-fenced studentships at masters and at postgraduate research level. We're also trying to support underrepresented undergraduate students to allow them to develop their CVs and really be credible applicants for prestigious postgraduate studentships through targeted summer research placements to give them that research experience in a funded way. So these are funded summer placements. And we've also launched specific early career fellowships called the EDI Pereira Fellowships. And we've launched 7 new fellows at Manchester for early career researchers who are underrepresented further along the career pipeline. And we've also been looking at what we value in terms of when we're recruiting researchers. So we're piloting anonymised CVs and also the Royal Society and UKRI-led narrative CV. So this is much more focusing on your contribution to research rather than some of those narrow metrics that around publications and grants that we've been very fixated on within the sector so far. And again, another form of positive action that we're piloting is something called the Rooney-Mansfield rule. So this is where at least 1 in 3 candidates that are shortlisted for interview that meet the criteria should be from an underrepresented group. We've also worked hard to broaden out our reward and recognition mechanisms, and particularly for early career researchers who, we've created specific research excellence awards, not just again on those narrow metrics of publication output, but also wider research impact and contribution to the research environment. We also have a very clear career path for research staff and an annual promotions call that is independent of their external finite funding, and training and mentorships to support research staff to really evidence their achievements and work towards promotion. And really lots of new initiatives to pump prime independent research at the early career researcher level and allow diverse researchers to develop that network of support and advocacy that is so essential to currently in the current culture to academic career success. So we have new funding schemes for those things, and also for any additional caring costs that might be incurred through profile raising activity. We're also addressing grant disparities through targeted workshops for women and ethnic minorities, giving diverse researchers opportunities to observe external funding panels. And most recently, we've just launched an inclusive advocacy programme partnering talented early career researchers from underrepresented groups with senior research leaders who will advocate for them, identify opportunities, and really give them a leg up in a way that happens anyway within the academy, but just extend that advocacy to people that historically would not have received it before. One thing that we know from our data and from our qualitative is taken. So that could be maternity, paternity, adoption leave. It could be through sickness. It could be men and women from any background. So for our academics who are on a teaching and research pathway, when they come back from extended leave of 6 months or more, we are pump priming their research activity. We are safeguarding them from teaching and administrative activity, and we are allowing them to focus in to get their research back on track. This really has been shown to reap real benefits, protected time to secure grants, to write papers, to step up to leadership roles, and really strong qualitative experiences. Statements like this is the best thing that has happened in my academic career. We've also invested heavily in targeted leadership development programs, and we have targeted programs at the national level. I'm the Aurora champion for the institution, and we've tracked the careers of people who've been on this women's leadership program, showing that twice as likely to be promoted compared to counterparts more nationally. And we also have an in-house women's leadership program for women who are already within leadership roles, and we are part of a national pilot program by the Women's Higher Education Network, the 100 Black women professors now, and we have 5 Black women academics on that program. The real power of this program is that actually we're also working with our senior leadership team so that they can understand the systemic disadvantage within the organisation, and also hear and support the experiences of the participants on the programme. And we've also specifically launched this year a new leadership programme for researchers at all levels to promote authentic and inclusive leadership. So that's just a snapshot of the targeted programme, but through my evaluation, what we hear from people on those programmes is it's no point in having discussions around gender and race and disability and how it plays out in the academy and how it prevents progression and career success. We need men here. We need everybody, our current leaders and managers, to be engaged and accountable and empowered to act as role models of inclusion. So we have created a new leadership framework at Manchester and a self-assessment capability tool. And within this is the key attribute of role model for inclusion. So we are currently cascading this out, starting with our senior leadership, and really getting them to think about what are the behaviours of an inclusive leader, what can they practically do, and really to identify what's in it for them, what's their personal why, and what things will they commit to. And this is something that we will then be cascading throughout the organisation to all of our leaders and managers, and following up with them to see the impact of those inclusive actions. And finally, the one thing I wanted to share was, we're not just engaging our senior leaders and managers throughout the organisation. We're really starting to embed equality, diversity and inclusion practice into our teaching. So we, 2 years ago, launched a unit called Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Your Role in Shaping a Fairer World, for our undergraduate students. So right at the start of their researcher career journey. So this basically takes them and connects them with the history and legislation around equality, diversity and inclusion, and then takes a deep dive into how equality, diversity and inclusion plays out in the workplace, in education, in health and social care, but importantly in research and innovation. And the final module brings it all together and asks them to think about their role as an inclusive leader. And again, in the same way as we're doing with our senior leaders and managers, to identify what steps they're going to take towards a more inclusive future culture across the academy. And here we can see Dawn Edge, who I job share with, our one Black woman professor, as a real role model within our organisation for equality, diversity and inclusion. The one final point I really wanted to make was, you know, in terms of, we really want to understand our current culture. We want to create a safe space and environment where people can call out poor behaviours and discrimination. And we have really been much more to do in terms of visibility and engagement with this. And we have embarked on a programme of active bystander training with our researchers to really help them understand what microaggressions, poor behaviours might look like in the context of academic research, get them to explore through case studies what's acceptable, and how to really challenge poor behaviours, but then signposting to this formal confidential support system within the institution. So it's a very whistle-stop tour of what we've been doing in terms of embedding EDI and research at Manchester. I would absolutely acknowledge that we are at the start of our journey to transform our culture and work towards equality, diversity and inclusion. We are actively priming research in this area so that we have strong evidence base for what's leading to inequalities, and we know what works. So we're not just throwing lots of initiatives, we're fully evaluating them. I will provide the link in the chat to the wider work. We're also creating a toolkit. There are several toolkits, again, that I'll provide the link to around inclusive research practice. And I would like to thank the Wellcome and University of Manchester who have funded much of the work that I've discussed today. So I'm going to stop sharing then, James, and open up for questions.
Rachel, thank you. Sorry, pardon me. Rachel, thank you very much. Also, I'd like to apologise. We had enabled closed captioning for the webinar in the Zoom settings, but unfortunately, for some reason, it's not appearing in the options of people's Zoom toolbar. We're not quite sure what's happening with that. We don't want to kind of edit the webinar settings at the moment in case we kick everybody out, but we'll look at this over the lunch break. It may be that we stop the webinar briefly and then restart it with revised settings. So my apologies for that. I will make sure that captioning appears in the recordings. Okay, Rachel, thank you for that fascinating presentation. It was really interesting to hear about the problems which are sector-wide and society-wide, but particularly within the research community, and the efforts that you and your colleagues in Manchester have made to address and improve equality, diversity, inclusion and equity of participation. We've had a variety of questions come through already and a lot of interesting comments in the chat. First question, there's clearly a lot for institutions to do in the EDI space and systemic issues to overcome, but what are your top tips for individual researchers in terms of
recording stop, recording in progress.
EDI?
Okay, I think I heard that. So what are the top tips for individuals?
Yes, in terms of promoting embedding EDI. Yeah,
so the first thing I would do is I would look at your research team. There's an exercise called the Trusted 10. Just think about your Trusted 10 work colleagues and have a look at how diverse they are, and then start to extend your networks, start to speak to people, ask people to share diverse experiences of working in the academy and try and extend your networks. Mm-hmm. So also have a look at who you're citing. You know, is it really narrow? Is it really very Western focused? Is it specific groups? And then have a look more widely, maybe look at more diverse publications within your discipline. Also think about, in terms of events and organising events, look at diversity in terms of who you're inviting to speak, to lead thinking. You know, so I noticed that there's really wonderful gender balance within the event today, but we don't have that ethnic diversity in terms of shaping decision making and thinking in the future around this space.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, what kind of leadership, asked Christopher, do we need to make a real impact on the barriers to opportunities for women and for minorities? He notes that he's worked for a kind of inspirational leader in the past who took a long view of actions necessary to bring forward women in research at a time when it was hard to find anybody who, you know, people who could overcome those barriers by themselves. So in terms of leadership and the long-term nature of this, what would you suggest?
So in terms of, if you look at some of the competencies of inclusive leaders, it would be very much awareness of your own biases and blind spots, a real commitment to identify and engage diverse voices within your own decision making. So being very consultative, listening to people in a meaningful way to inform your decisions. And then I think where we are at Manchester is very much around making sure that we work towards, at the moment, we've always had equality targets, but they've sat very much outside of research and outside of teaching and learning. But now we're embedding those so that they are targets that all researchers across the institution can see and can be working towards. So as a senior leader in an organisation, I think, you know, embedding equality targets into areas of activity that are already valued would be critical.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. What's the best way of getting senior management on board to embed EDIs, noting that they often look for junior staff to come up with all solutions in this regard?
I think that really has been a challenge. I think actually maybe we're at a crossroads. There's really very strong messages coming from the funders of research. That this is an area of priority. So I think that's very persuasive for senior leaders within our organisation. And then also working with them on an individual level, because oftentimes they actually don't know what they can do. They're not sure how to address this. They maybe don't perceive any cultural issues in terms of their own experiences and progression to that senior leadership position. So really in a form of reverse mentoring, getting them to hear and understand the experiences, particularly of their students. That's a very diverse community, and actually expectations of our students who are very progressive in the thinking in this area, you know, they are really driving and calling for change as well, and the senior leaders are definitely listening to that.
Thank you. Emily asks, are you aware of statistics for professional services staff in higher education? She observes that she feels it's dominated by female staff, but that the professional service staff are rarely included in reviews such as this. Do you think EDI should be expanded to look at all staff in institutions, whether academic or otherwise?
Yeah, that's a really very valid point, and I think that's probably historical, because initially Athena Swan, our gender equality charter, which has had traction, only focused in originally on academics in STEM. Now it's across all staff groups and professional services. We know at Manchester, for example, women are in the majority in our professional services. But then if you look at the highest level, it doesn't match at the early PS level. And also, if you look and you separate PS into different directorates, so if you looked at technical staff, for example, women will be particularly underrepresented. So, you know, you need to look in a much more nuanced way and break down PS into different groups as well. And we're doing that piece of work. Also, career progression for professional services is the pathways and reward and recognition schemes are not there. And that's a real hot area of discussion across the sector in terms of how we can create new pathways to recognise and for PS staff to progress. So we're specifically looking at new technical pathways, for example.
Does that tie in with? Brilliant. That's good to know. Thank you. Inca asks, do you have suggestions for how to prevent overburdening, which inadvertently can happen when trying to make recruitment in other panels more diverse, especially when you're starting from small numbers of people from minority backgrounds on such panels?
Yeah, so we're very conscious of that. So I know some institutions have had a pool of unconscious bias observers or diversity champions. So two ways around that would be to include it within time allocation and within role descriptors for those individuals, or actually to extend it and allow people from early career stages where we do have good diversity. Why does it need to be a senior person? Maybe we could have someone at a more junior career stage who could provide that role as well. But it is a problem. It is a problem.
Thank you. Katie asks, she's interested in representation of different sexualities in HEIs, but notes that sexuality is not often widely considered in EDI data at institutions. It might feature in reports, she notes, but it's often not the focus of initiatives targeting underrepresentation. She was interested to know your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think our data and the confidence to disclose sexual orientation has been low across the sector. We are working hard. We have been a Stonewall top 100 employer consistently for the last 5 years, and really we don't have role models either within our senior leadership team.
Yeah.
So there's lots to do in that space, and I agree. We need more focus beyond just gender, race, and disability.
Excellent, thank you very much. Sue asks, how did the senior management team respond to unconscious bias observers if they raise issues, say during recruitment, and do you keep track of issues raised?
So we haven't, and I think that's a really great suggestion. So we've not been asking our observers to report in that way. We have been providing briefing so that there's and they fully understand what the unconscious bias observer is there to do. And I think people are open to feedback and discussion, but I agreed sometimes there's a power dynamic, and maybe people will have observed things and will not have been able in that moment to say something and influence that decision.
Thank you very much. Okay, a few more questions and lots of interesting things in the chat. Please do keep it coming. We've had a few questions about sharing the chat stream after the event. I'll just note we'll need to check the data protection implications that obviously people making comments in a public space in an open event. So I think it's fine, but we'll need to check. If not, I'm sure we can maybe share something that's anonymized, because lots of interesting ideas and interesting links there. So please do keep them coming. Okay. Yes, a comment and a question. It can sometimes appear that a lot of work done in the EDI space is being driven by the activism of members of underrepresented communities and parts of society. How do we make this an issue for everyone, an issue for people who think this stuff is not a priority for them personally? Yeah,
so that has been how the approach, the burden of activity and work has fallen on women and minorities up to this point. Actually, one of our EDI priorities now is to include a personal equality objective in all of our staff appraisals. So I talked about starting with our senior leaders, but that will be an expectation for all of our staff. So that is a bit of a stick-based approach. A more carrot-based approach is around the education and really incentivizing our staff that actually, to identify what their personal reasons for prioritizing this would be, but also to really clearly make the link that actually it's holding us back. It's holding us back. Equity will lead to excellence, which is what all of our institutions care about, both excellence in research and excellence in teaching and learning. So making that connection much clearer.
Thank you, that's really helpful. It ties in, we had a webinar on ADI recently back in April. One thing that came out in the sessions there is, Niels, this isn't just about, it's quite rightly about making sure that everybody is treated equally, that there's equity and participation, but there are also ancillary benefits, because the greater diversity in research, the better research that we do, because diverse perspectives mean different ways of looking at problems and challenges in the research space, and we get better answers that way rather than perspectives from a particular subset of the population. And that's a really important thing. This is about better outcomes for individuals, definitely, that's worth doing in its own sake. It's also as a beneficial side effect, perhaps one could articulate it, it helps research quality. So for those who don't want to consider issues of EDI, even though they should be, you can also use to say, well, this will lead you to better research and better research teams. There are various levers there for change. That was a fascinating talk, Rachel. Thank you so much. And also for fulfilling the very difficult slot of being the last speaker before lunch, which is always a challenging one. I'd like to thank our previous speakers and also our attendees who kept the discussions and the questions coming thick and fast, and the chat streams for really lively observations, debate, discussions, helpful resources, and some lovely peer-to-peer network going on, which is great because it's especially hard to do in virtual space as opposed to in-person meetings. So thank you very much for that. Now we will be pausing the conference for lunch now, and we'll be resuming at 2 p.m. Now we will normally leave the conference running and keep it going and keep the link live with a slideshow going. We're trying to sort out a closed captioning issue here, and it may be that we need to close and restart the webinar. So if it vanishes from your screens at any time, the link you used to get in this morning will get you back in for the afternoon sessions, okay? And I'll just quickly share those sessions with you. Okay, so we'll break for it until 2, and then when you rejoin, we have 3 sessions looking at systems and influences on research integrity, kind of the big stuff that permeates how we do research and poses challenges for us. So we'll have James Wilsden, our second keynote speaker of the day, talking about whether we can kind of tinker around the edges of the research systems or whether we need to be a bit more radical. We'll have representatives of 3 other organizations who work on research integrity in the UK. And then finally, Susan Velsman will joining us from South Africa to talk about a particular blight of the research system, combating predatory journals and conferences. So thank you so much for being part of the event this morning. We look forward to seeing you again at 2. We will leave the webinar open with these placeholder slides up and running, but it may be that we have to shut it down and restart it to get the closed captioning up and going. I am sorry about this. The settings are there. It should be working. So we'll see you again at 2, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you all very much for being a part of the conference this morning. It's the discussions, the sessions have all been fascinating and really lively. And my thanks to those speakers and our very interested, engaged audience. It's great to have you all here, and we look forward to seeing you in about an hour's time. So enjoy your lunch, get up your chairs, get away from your monitors for a bit, and we'll see you again at 2. Thank you all very much, and see you later.
Recording stopped.